Welcome back everyone, it's Eric from Raricani, and today Xander will be joining me to give our full set review of the next Sword and Shield set, Rebel Clash. Rebel Clash brings us plenty more of the new Pokemon V and VMAX mechanic that was just introduced back in Sword and Shield, including some very hyped new ones like Eldegoss V and Dragapult VMAX, just to name a few. And this set, like most, is comprised of cards from multiple Japanese sets, this time being VMAX Rising, Rebellious Clash, as well as some Japanese promo cards and some box exclusives that they have. And this all totals up to 190 plus cards, which makes Rebel Clash actually one of the smaller sets we've had in a while. But even despite that, I think there's still a ton to get excited about from this set. And honestly, I really don't mind the smaller set size anyways. I think Pokemon was getting a little bit carried away with how big some of these recent sets were getting. So I definitely welcome this change. And it's also worth pointing out too that at the time of recording, we actually don't have the official international set list for Rebel Clash just yet. So by the time the set comes out, there very well could be a random Japanese promo or unreleased card that could slip into the set. But all of the cards covered here, or at least 99% of them, should wind up making their way into the full set once it releases. But before we get into the actual set review, let's take a quick look at the rating system that we're going to be using. So as you can see, we have three different ratings we can potentially give out to cards, and the first of which is going to be our bad rating. So these cards have anywhere from no to very limited competitive potential outside of maybe some extremely niche and select uses. These are by and large just going to be your bulk junk rares that will never see any play for as long as they are legal in the format, outside of some sort of unforeseen crazy change to the state of the game that somehow enables them to be playable. So for our second, more neutral rating, these cards have some competitive potential, but their viability might be stifled by other factors in the current metagame. So for cards like this, an example I like to use is maybe the card we're looking at is an otherwise decent card, but maybe its worst matchup in the format happens to be the most popular deck in the format at that time, shutting out from seeing play, or maybe it's a card that is just, maybe one combo piece or additional card being printed away from suddenly making it playable. And of course, our final good rating we have here says these cards have high competitive potential, existing on a spectrum ranging from seeing mild play to seeing widespread play. So if you guys are more familiar with a 1 to 5 rating scale, these are cards that would fall somewhere on that 3 to 5 spectrum. But of course, when we record these set reviews, guys, we usually haven't had hands-on time with a lot of the cards in the set up until this point. So we don't really feel too comfortable at giving a firm numerical score, and feel a more general rating like this is a bit more fair. We have a lot of cards to talk about today, and to make things easier on you, we've actually pinned timestamps to the top of the comments section of this video. So if there's a certain card in particular you want to hear about, you can scroll down and jump to any card in this set review. But with all this out the way now, strap in, get comfortable, and let's see what Rebel Clash has in store for us. So up first we have the Butterfree evolution line. So before we get to Butterfree though, I think it actually is really important to point out Caterpie and Metapod, because honestly these are kind of the cards that are even making us discuss this evolution line in the first place. But we're looking at these because they have that adaptive evolution ability that lets them evolve on the first turn that they play it. So these are actually the same abilities that we saw on the Caterpie and Metapod back from Flashfire, and of course is a very similar effect to the Forest of Giant Plants and Broken Time Space from the past. So being able to evolve immediately is definitely super solid, but really these cards are only as good as the quality of Butterfrees that we have access to. So let's take a look at Butterfree here. It's a stage 2, 140 HP, has two different attacks here, the first of which for just a single grass energy is 30 damage, and your opponent's active is now Poison, Burn, and Confused. And its second attack, just for 2 colorless energy or a twin energy, just does a vanilla 80 damage. So really quick, if we run through the math on this card, if you factor in all the different special conditions, you're doing 30 to base damage, plus 20 from Burn, putting us up to 50, plus another 10 in between turns from Poison, and then Confusion. So this effectively reads for 1 grass, 60 and Confused, which isn't awful, but I really just don't know if this is actually good enough to build around. Actually, I do know it's not good enough to build your deck around this card, unfortunately. Xander, I mean, that's where I'm at. I mean, we do have some different damage modifying cards like the Infernape still in format to increase burn damage. We have the Toxicroak from Sword and Shield to increase poison damage. But I think that just seems really clunky. There's a lot better ways to two-shot your opponent in the current format, and I just don't know if Butterfree has what it takes.
Even with the Turffield Stadium that lets you search your deck for a grass Pokemon and put it into your hand once per turn, you're still stuck. Like, I don't even know if you're two-shotting things. Like, if for some magical reason this deck ever got good, people would just play one Mallow and Lana, and you would just completely lose to it. There's no situation that this deck gets good and stays good. Status conditions are generally gimmicky. And even though you're doing 3 of them for 1 energy, it's like, okay, cool, you're doubling the power of your attack. Not really that great. And the confusion is also just meh. So I think overall, I'm just not impressed with Butterfree. There's not too much to say about it past that. The Caterpie and Metapod are obviously good, but they balance these Butterfrees about being not great because they keep giving the Caterpie and the Metapod good abilities.
Now, I will say this in regards to the Caterpie and Metapod, there is actually a Butterfree back from Unbroken Bonds. Just for a colorless energy, you search your deck for 3 basic energies and attach them to your Pokemon any way that you like. So if you actually go second, you actually have kind of a cool way you can accelerate a bunch of energies. So if you're a type that doesn't really have great energy acceleration, you might actually be able to get away with playing this Butterfree. The new Butterfree is pretty bad. I just want to give a shout out to the old one. I think there is some consideration for that. But definitely feel free to keep a playset on hand of Caterpie and Metapod, because you guys never know when they might actually decide to give us a decent Butterfree in the future. Alrighty guys, so next up we have a new Ludicolo we're going to be looking at, and much like with the Butterfree we just looked at as well, this actually does have a pretty notable pre-evolution that we do need to go over. So before we get to Ludicolo, let's take a look at Lombre. It has this ability. Actually, this is going to be a reoccurring thing in this set review. There are a couple of other cards that have this same sort of effect, but Lombre is one of them, and it has this ability. If you draw this card from your deck at the beginning of your turn and there is room on your bench, instead of putting it into your hand, you may play it directly onto your bench. And that just has kind of a vanilla attack here, not really worth talking about. But this ability actually is really, really interesting. You know, far too often the stage 1s of our stage 2 evolution lines wind up being, you know, pretty forgettable and aren't that great. And anytime a stage 2 has any sort of consistency boosting effects built into its pre-evolutions, that's something that always makes us have to kind of reevaluate, you know, the playability of some of its evolutions. So Lombre, I don't think this ability is super busted, but nevertheless, I think this will increase your odds of being able to get out your Ludicolos. The big obvious use with this is you pair it with Oranguru, use Oranguru's ability to put Lombre on top of your deck, and then on your next turn, you'll draw into it and get to put it on your bench, cheating its way into play. So that's kind of the big combo we're going to be looking at here. But going on to Ludicolo itself, Ludicolo is going to be a grass type stage 2, 160 HP, has 2 different attacks, the first of which for just 2 colorless energy, does 60 for each prize card you've taken, and its second attack for a grass and 2 colorless is 120, and you heal 30 from this Pokemon. So 120 heal 30 for 3, not really very good. However, I do think the first attack does have some merit to it. So if we just run through the math really quick, if you've already taken 5 prizes, just as an example, and you get this Ludicolo into play, you're going to be able to do 300 damage, which is nothing to scoff at in a format where you have these huge Pokemon V and Pokemon VMAX, and even Pokemon GX still running around in the format. And of course, you can power this up with just a single twin energy, which is coming out in this set. So, I mean, I think there is some consideration to Ludicolo, but you definitely cannot build around this card whatsoever. It's just not a good enough attacker to be a deck of its own.
I at least think that this Ludicolo is not necessarily the best one for attacking. I went back and looked at the other Ludicolos in Standard. The reprint of the really old one is still in Standard, the one that lets you draw a card, and then for Water 2 colorless, you do 70 plus 10 for each Pokemon you have in play, which is better with Twin Energy that's coming out in this set, which is essentially a DCE for non-V and GX Pokemon, so get ready to hear us talk about that card a lot. But even with this Ludicolo instead with the Lombre as the interesting card, if the whole bench is filled, you're only doing 190, and that requires they fill up the entire board, so I don't think that that's really reliable whatsoever. Where I am interested to see the Lombre and Ludicolo see play is in, like, not in its own deck, but maybe even like a 0-2 line in something that's already playing a Oranguru. Like, if your deck just cannot take the last few prizes because you run out of stuff really quick, if you can take a big knockout on a tag team, this is doing 180. If you can knock out a tag team in a day-to-day, it's doing 300. But I think that the playability of this specific Ludicolo here is going to be based off of, like, splashing it into decks, because the first attack, which I would say is the better one of the two, does nothing at the beginning of the game, which is not helpful. But the Lombre ability gets disrupted a lot more than I think people are kind of thinking about. Marnie messes up Lombre if you try to stack it on top of your deck at the end of your turn. Reset Stamp messes it, and those are 2 cards that are seeing lots of play. But yeah, I'm unimpressed overall. I know I spitballed a bunch of ideas, but I think all of them are inconclusive to ending. Like, they don't round up to this being a good card.
And I will say this, one thing that is unfortunate about the situation you kind of just highlighted about kind of teching a line like this into your deck is that now with water being weak to lightning and not grass with sword and shield, I think the main deck that would maybe consider something like this would maybe be a fire deck that plays Magcargo and Magcargo GX and a Ranguru. That seems like the most likely of culprits for that sort of strategy, and that actually gets kind of worse as time goes on, just due to some of the type switch ups that we've seen with the new Sword and Shield era. So there's definitely some cool things going on here, but I'm right with you, man. I don't think this card is, super good at the moment, though. Alrighty guys, up next we actually have our very first Pokemon V and Pokemon VMAX of the set review. That's going to be Rilla Boom V and Rilla Boom VMAX. So before we get to the VMAX, of course, let's take a look at the base form Rilla Boom V. It has 220 HP, Fire Weakness, 3 Retreat, 2 different attacks here. For the first attack, for a Grass Energy Search Deck, for up to 2 basic Grass Pokemon, put them onto your bench, then shuffle your deck. And then its second attack, for 3 Grass and the Car List, is 220, and this Pokemon takes 30. And then Rilla Boom VMAX, of course, the big daddy of the evolution line here, 330 HP, Fire Weakness, 3 Retreat. First attack for a single colorless energy does 50 damage, and then second attack for 3 grass and a colorless does 130, and you may discard up to 3 grass energy from this Pokemon, and this attack does 50 more for each you discard in this way. But one thing I actually do like specifically about Rilla Boom V, its first attack is actually really solid. Anytime you have an evolution line that can boost your consistency and help get your Pokemon and different combo pieces in play and moving, that is going to be definitely a good thing. So really great first attack on the Rilla Boom V. And if we run through the math on Rilla Boom VMAX, if you discard 3 grass energy, you're going to do 280 damage, which is a very relevant number. That means you knock out basically all of the different tag teams that are running around in the current format. And of course, you're going to 2-shot VMAXs, which is, fine. So I think Rilla Boom VMAX seems like a pretty cool card. Xander, I know you had some thoughts about this one, so I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, first off, I think the list builds itself. Like, you have the Rilla Boom from Sword and Shield, you have Turffield, which we just talked about, and then other lists are running Rowlet and Alolan Exeggutor to be able to get out the Rilla Boom even quicker. They knew that all these cards were going to be in standard together. They wanted this Rilla Boom V to be something that was playable, and I think they succeeded. But outside of that, I think that it is solid. Like, we have the cards that kind of allowed the Vikavolt Tapu Bulu deck to succeed in standard. Rosa being a huge one that I think that is a card that deck did not have that will help this deck out a lot. Turffield is a blessing, just being able to search for Rilla Boom VMAX and for Thwackey and Rilla Boom. I'm worried that it's going to be a little bit linear and kind of need to get the right draws, just as any Stage 2 deck is. Like, is it worth committing a Stage 2 Pokemon onto your bench when there's options like Welder and stuff in Standard? Which I know that we draw that comparison all the time, but your upside has to be really good to surpass the energy acceleration effects like Welder and Metal Patch and Intrepid Sword. So I'm not sure where this card exists in the long run, but I think that between the consistency offered by Rilla Boom V's Verse Attack to call for family for 2 grass basics, and then on your next turn, you can just go Rare Candy, Rilla Boom, attack, get there. The deck builds itself. It's powerful. We've seen stuff like this before be good, and I think we'll see it again be good. Though I don't necessarily think they're the most interesting. I think they're certainly powerful.
So I'll actually say that I do think people will commit to playing a Stage 2. I know you were a little bit on the fence about it, but when you have a Stage 2 that can get its basics into play very easily thanks to things like Netball and, of course, the Call for Family style effect on Rilla Boom V, and with the Turffield Stadium we keep pointing out that can search for grass evolutions, it's really not even too much of an inconvenience to get out your Stage 2, which I think does make it enticing for Rilla Boom VMAX. I think one of the big things that is something we have to keep in mind is the pesky fire weakness. Welder, even though it did get hurt by the first turn rule change, is still an insanely good card. And there are some pretty decent new fire Pokemon coming out in this set, in addition to all of the very good ones that already exist, which means Rilla Boom is going to have to kind of worry about his weakness. Now, granted, you can play things like Weakness Guard Energy if you do choose to, but nevertheless, I just want to point out fire Pokemon are still very powerful, and it's something Rilla Boom VMAX is going to have to watch out for. But I'm right there with you, Xander. This deck's going to be super linear, which is fine, but it's going to hit like a truck, and it's going to get you where you need to be, I think, a lot of the time. So I'm also kind of a fan of this. It's kind of like the foil to the Rowlet Alolan Exeggutor Rilla Boom deck, whereas that one's much more defensive and a little bit more conservative. The Rilla Boom VMAX is the polar opposite. It's a 3-prize attacker, but this one's just going all in on taking big one-hit knockouts. So kind of cool that Rilla Boom has 2 different sort of routes you can take, a deck around the card, which I think is really cool for deck building. But I'm right there with you. I think this evolution line is pretty solid. Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon V. That is going to be Eldegoss V. Eldegoss V is a basic with 180 HP, so a little bit on the lower side compared to some of the other Pokemon V we've seen get printed thus far. Fire weakness, 1 retreat cost, has this ability. Once during your turn, whenever you play this card from your hand onto your bench, you may put a supporter card from your discard pile into your hand. And then its single attack here for 2 colorless energy is 50, and you may shuffle this Pokemon, all cards attached to it, into your deck. So Eldegoss V, of course, is the next Pokemon in the line of very strong 2-prize support Pokemon, much like with Dedenne GX, Shaman EX, Tapu Lele GX, etc. This ability is just very, very good. I don't think this is quite as over the top broken as something like Shaman or Tapu Lele, but don't get it confused. I think this ability is super good. It's just Versus Seeker, which is great. So after you've, dumped your hand in late game, maybe you need a supporter, you don't have one, you can just quick ball, get your Eldegoss V out, grab yourself a Professor's Research, or maybe grab the new Boss's Orders to get that knockout on a Dedenne for game, whatever it might be. Eldegoss V, this card's just absolutely, no questions asked, going to see play. It's a really straightforward card. Xander, I feel like I'm hogging a lot of what there is to say about this card, but I just feel like there's not too much. It's just blatantly good.
No, you could have done this one on your own, but I think that in a vacuum, it might actually end up being better than Lele and stuff like that. I know that that's odd, but Lele's value goes down a lot more throughout the game, whereas this value goes up. And so any turn after your first turn, you're going to have a supporter in the discard pile, most likely, given that you've played a supporter. You're going to get a draw supporter, and then with stuff like Boss's Orders coming out, which is just Lysander, we'll talk about that card too, and then even stuff like a one of Marnie for whenever you need to shuffle their hand into their deck, or you can get like a Cynthia and Caitlyn so you can get a supporter for your next turn, but then you can still draw 3 cards on your current turn. I think that this definitely allows a lot of options towards the end game and how decks are going to be constructed. Not in the same way that Versus Seeker was, because Versus Seeker is a 4-of, it's an item, it's not a bench space, it cannot possibly give up prizes. But I do think that it's great. And Soar Upward is very good too. Just being able to put it back into your deck so you can reuse it. Luckily, you cannot use Twin Energy, or else that'd be very annoying, but it still is a good card.
So just to add on to what you're saying too, you mentioned the idea of having a one of Marnie. And one of the things that I actually kind of miss about Versus Seeker is the fact that it really opened you up to being able to play various different one of supporters for different sort of matchups and different instances. And that is something Eldegoss V kind of enables to an extent. Granted, like you said, you're not playing 4 of this. It's probably just going to be a 1 of, a 2 of maybe in most decks. But nevertheless, it does open you up to being able to play some of these one-of supporters that normally would be a little bit inconsistent to find when you need. But the fact now you can just quick ball them away, or Professor's Research them away to keep safely in your discard for whenever you need them is something that I think is really cool, and I think a good thing for the game. So this is definitely a good card. Absolutely pick this up. Super good card. Alright guys, next up we have Flapple, his first introduction to the TCG. Flapple, of course, is a Stage 1 Pokemon. This has 80 HP, Fire Weakness, 1 retreat cost, and has this ability. Once during your turn, you may put 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon, then shuffle this Pokemon and all cards attached to it into your deck. And then it does have an attack of its own too for 2 colorless energy, does 60 damage, and flip a coin if heads discard an energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. I'm actually kind of a fan of this card. I know Xander's probably going to roast me for saying that shortly, but I'm a really big fan of this ability. I guess that also kind of makes sense because throughout my time playing the game, I've played a number of different spread decks. I've played Weezing, Decidueye, even going back to other things like the Crobat from Phantom Forces, etc. So I've always kind of been a sucker for these style of abilities, and this one's really cool because I think one of the downsides to cards of the past like Crobat, as an example, is once you've evolved into it, it just kind of sits there on your bench, takes up bench space that could be used for other more important things, and you can't reuse that ability unless you play something like a scoop up sort of effect. But I really like this because after you get the benefit, This goes right back into your deck, freeing your bench spot up for something more important, or maybe even allowing you to set up another Flapple for the following turn to get some more chip damage in with this ability. So I think the attack is also kind of decent as well, just because you can power it up with Twin Energy, and 60 discard in energy really isn't that awful. But of course, the abilities really, I think, where this card could potentially see play. I think there's consideration of maybe attempting some sort of spread archetype with this, just swarming these, maybe wheezing even. Hard to say. Or maybe just playing this as kind of like a math fixer. Right now we don't have anything like Shrine in the format or Choice Band that affects Pokemon V. Now we have things like Vitality Band as an example, but we really don't have anything that can do better than like 10 extra damage at a time. I'm kind of unsure of the ideal path for this card, but I have to say, like, there's just a part of me that really does like this, and I'm really looking forward to trying this out. Now, I'm going to quit rambling because I know Xander has definitely some less than kind words about this card, so I'll pass it to him, and he can tell you why I'm wrong.
All right, I've officially reached the bottom of the barrel and put together a Flapple deck, and I'm going to share it with you right now in my extremely beneficial 5 minutes of thinking. You build Flapple as a stall deck with the Appleton, which we're going to talk about next, as a one of. You play Flapple and you just like bring up their Pokemon, and they never can retreat them because you discard their energy. You have Galar Mine, and we're just going to assume that they don't play switching supporters because they're bad. Who needs those? But the benefit of the ability is that you can shuffle away these Flapples so that you can knock them out during your turn so that they don't get to choose what they send up. You knock them out, and then they send something up, and then you hopefully use Appleton or Boss's orders, and you bring up the thing that you want to start denying their energy. And for as long as you do that, you win the game. That's the best I got. I don't think that this card is great just in terms of damage fixing, because I don't know if it's worth the commitment in a lot of decks. Like, I feel like if I'm playing this, I'm playing a 2-2, and if I'm playing it, I probably want to be playing grass stuff on top of it to help fix math. Like, if there's ever a universe that the Rilla Boom deck needs to hit 300, I could see playing a 1-1 of this in the deck. Just being able to get to that number. Or, like, if there's a magical choice band reprint, then that lets you get to 330. So I think that where Flapple... Like, the problem is, like, is it worth the deck space to play 2 cards at a minimum, most likely more, to get a one-time 20 damage and then have to do some work to get it back out? And I'm not sure that the answer is yes. Because, like, yes, there are definitely some times that I'm like, man, if I had, like, a Kukui in my hand, which is not even, like, a thing, but, like, just for the 20 damage, if I had that in my hand, I'd be able to win this game. But I don't know if we're at the point that we're committing to a stage 1 that practically, if they see it coming, they like, you either want to use it on the turn that you put it into play, or be taking the knockout like on the something that you've already hit. So like, I guess it's effectively the same thing. It's like you're either gonna play it, use it, then attack, or attack and then don't have it in play, just have the Apple in play and then evolve. But like, in a world of 300 and 330 and 280 HP Pokemon, I'm not convinced that putting 2 damage counters on someone's board is really where it's at. If this card does end up seeing play, I won't be super surprised, but I think it'll only be because there are other damage modifiers that are also helping clinch the gap between a potential 2-shot and then a 1-shot now.
So I think all that's fair. I'm still going to stand beside Flapple, stick my neck out on this card a little bit. Like I said, I don't think the path for it is clear, but I like this ability enough, and I think there's enough of a precedent set by other similar sorts of cards to maybe commit to saying that Flapple might see some plays. I'm a fan of it, and I'm excited to see what might come out of it. Alright guys, next up we have the other Applin evolution line. That's going to be Appleton. So Appleton is a stage 1 Pokemon, 90 HP, fire weakness, 3 retreat cost, and we're really just looking at for this ability here. Once during your turn you may flip a coin. If heads, choose one of your opponent's benched basic Pokemon and switch it with their active Pokemon. So this is kind of like a nerfed version of Pokemon Catcher. And it's funny enough, actually leading into this set review, I actually didn't read this right. I was under the impression this was Catcher, and I was kind of like gassed up about this card. This was one of my kind of like underdog cards of the set until Xander pointed out to me it is just basic Pokemon. And yeah, as you guys can tell by my rating on screen, I think significantly less of this card now. Now, granted, I will actually say that right now we are in a relatively basic heavy format. So a lot of the time this is just going to be catcher, but it is definitely a bit of a bummer that this is limited to just basic Pokemon. So I think one of the big things that really hurts this card in particular is the fact that it's getting printed in the same set that Boss's Orders is going to be printed in. Because in Japan, this came out 2 months prior to Boss's Orders, and it was looking like this card might have a chance to see some play, but the fact that we're getting that in the same set, I think pretty much nerfs the chances of this card being good. Now, granted, I think if you are playing the Flapple or some sort of designated Flapple deck with a thick line of the card already, I think you have to at least consider playing one of these. But I think the fact that we have so many different gusting options in the format right now, especially ones that aren't limited to just basics, I think might kind of push Appleton off the edge in terms of being kind of a viable gusting option.
It's worse than Boss's Orders. It is worse than Great Catcher. It is worse than Custom Catcher. And it is worse than Pokemon Catcher. And all of those cards are cards that are seeing play in their respective legal formats, being that the Boss's Orders is obviously not legal in America yet. And so I just think that all of those are going to outplace this. I do think that in a deck that you're playing Flapple, you probably play one no matter what, just so that you can get Vs before they VMAX or data nays or like random single prizers so that you don't kind of have to add up to 7 or 8 when you take your prizes. But I don't think this is worth playing in anything else.
Yeah, I'm right there on the same page with you. Just really bummed they did limit this to just basic Pokemon, because we've seen this ability before in the past on other Pokemon, but it's normally been on stage 2s. So the fact that we had this print as a stage 1, I was really excited about. But again, just a shame it is limited to just basic Pokemon. I think definitely that also makes the future of this card a little bit bleaker as well, especially as we get more and more VMAX Pokemon getting injected into the format. This becomes progressively worse. I think maybe if this card had been printed maybe 6 months ago, I think maybe we'd be singing a different tune. But just given the current circumstances, I really can't see a great case to be made for Appleton right now. Next up, we have ourselves a new Ninetales. Ninetales is a stage 1 Pokemon. 120 HP, water weakness, 1 retreat, has 2 different attacks, the first of which for a fire energy does 30 plus 90 more if your opponent's active has an ability. And then its second attack for a fire into colorless does 90 and your opponent's active is now asleep. So its second attack, not too special, but really the reason we're taking a look at Ninetales is, of course, for this first attack. And the reason for that is the fact that if you can fulfill this attack's requirement and they have an ability, you're hitting 120, and against a fire weak Pokemon, that means you're going to be hitting 240. And man, I wish there was some good fire weak Pokemon in the format right now. Xander, is there anything you can think of that's weak to fire that would that you would like to easily knock out?
Yeah, there's this really good card that came out in the last set that's called Zacian V. You might have heard of it. It is weak to fire, and it will get one shot by this attack. I think we're basically just here for the first attack, and even just as a way to one shot a Zacian for 1 energy, I think that this card is fine. But I also can't tell myself that 1 fire, 120 to a Pokemon that has an ability is bad. Like, I don't think that's a bad card. If we get in a situation that there's a non-GX 2-shotting deck, I think that this is really good. It can be used with just an Aurora energy, which is a card that's just waiting to be more broken than it already is. Currently, we see it in ADP and in Mewtwo, but that card is just asking to be very playable, and I think that this Ninetales is going to be a card that sees a lot with. I don't know where the home for this card is, but I cannot say this card's bad, because in a vacuum, this card is still really good, and in the context of Zacian being one of the best decks in format, it's even better. Because even against ADP Zacian, normally the fear against that deck with non-GXs and non-V Pokemon is that you're just going to get 3 of your Pokemon knocked out and the game's going to be over, but they have to attack the whole game with ADP, because if they ever bring up a Zacian, it just dies. Like, you kind of force them to have to play defense with ADP, and I think that as long as you kind of have something else to beat that plan, whether or not it's the copycat Mimikyu or something else, like, this definitely seems like a viable option for something that really wants to beat ADP. I don't know if you can splash it into your deck that easily, but this card's wild. It's very good.
One practical application I will kind of outline there if anyone wants to attempt to mess around with it. We're actually starting to get a good amount of single attachment stage 1s in the format. So there's of course Ninetales here, but we also have Breloom, we have Frostlass, there's even a Xatu that is coming out in this set. There's a Bisharp. So there's all these different typed stage 1s in the format that can potentially hit for weakness and maybe take some big one-hit knockouts as some sort of like anti-metagame deck. So I think that's a concept I honestly wouldn't mind exploring and including Ninetales in, just because all of them can attack with Aurora energies or unit energies. So that's something I personally want to try out. I'm not sure if that's like a particularly great home for this, but nevertheless, it's something you guys can at least start thinking about. But again, I'm ultimately going to fall a little bit neutral on this just because does this tip the Zacian matchup enough in their favor to where they would run some counts of this? And I'm just not sure. So for that reason, I'm going to remain a little bit neutral on it. Next up, guys, we have another Ninetales card, but this is going to be Ninetales V. This is going to be a new Pokemon V, 200 HP, water weakness, 2 retreat cost. Has 2 different attacks here. The second one is probably the more lackluster. We will point it out really quick. For fire and 3 colors does 180 and discard an energy from this Pokemon. But a little bit more notably, we have the first attack for a fire and 2 colorless. Choose one of your opponent's active Pokemon's attacks and use it as this attack. So Xander, I'm actually going to pass this one over to you. I know you were pretty enthusiastic about Ninetales here.
I think that for now, the Welder decks are already very good, and the deck that I'm most likely to put this into is the Mewtwo deck, just because there are some really good attacks that you don't have the energy cost to copy that this can help you with, because just a Welder and an energy gets you there. And one thing that's cool with the Mewtwo deck is that since you play Aurora energy, you can use like Altered Creation and have an Aurora energy count as the extra requirement. I think primarily for now, copying Ultimate Ray seems great. Copying Zacian's attack seems really good. Even in the control matchups, you can use this to copy resource management, which is really insane. So I think that this card just has a lot of utility, and it's just going to get better over time because cards are going to be printed with even more powerful attacks than the stuff that we have now, just due to the nature of power creep and due to how Pokemon prints cards. And for a Welder and an energy, you get to use any of their attacks that you want. Like this card just, it goes exponentially upward. There are some cards where like we don't know how this shakes out in the future when things get stronger. This card gets better as other things get stronger. So I think this is a slam dunk, like excellent card that I don't think you need many of. I'd probably get like 1 or 2 if you're thinking of buy list off of this video. It is in the potential to be one of the best cards in the set. Once you get down past the tier of Eldegoss and Boss's Orders and Twin Energy, I think this card is really good.
I guess my big reservation with this card is the fact that Fire already has just such an insane toolbox of different attackers that can abuse Welder right now. And you have to think, like, what attacks are you copying that your current suite of Fire attackers can't already do? You already have different Fire attackers that can accelerate energy. There's attacks that can just take huge one-hit knockouts, 2-hit knockouts. I think Ninetales has a lot of different Pokemon to compete with for deck space. I'm just not sure if I like my opponent's attacks more than all the existing broken attacks I have in my Fire deck. I guess that's what I'm getting at. But I will agree with him too, as we get more and more VMAXs print into the game, they are naturally going to be stronger than some of the tag teams previously that have done so well with the whole Welder engine. So of course, as we get stronger and stronger cards printed, like Xander said, I do think this attack does get better. I think this is one of those cards that I just need to get in actual games with and really just feel the practical application for this thing. I think it's a solid 1 of. I kind of like the card, but I don't think I like it enough to say it's one of the best cards in the set. So I'm kind of torn between ratings right now. I guess maybe I'll commit to saying it's good. Xander, you like convince me a little bit, but I'm definitely, as you can tell, a little bit reluctant to endorse the card. So I think it has practical applications, but again, I'm just not sure if they overshadow just attacking with the other Fire attackers that we have that are so good in the game right now. But I think it's definitely worth picking up at least 1 of this card for sure. I think I'll say this no matter what. I do think as time goes on, this card does get better and will debate we see more and more play as we get more and more VMAXs printed and injected into the format. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Arcanine. Arcanine is a Stage 1 Pokemon, 130 HP, Water Weakness to Retreat Cost. It has this ability, if this Pokemon has Burning Scarf attached, it gets plus 100 HP, and then its only attack here for 2 Fire and a Colorless does 130. And just to add some context too, if you guys aren't familiar with Burning Scarf, it is a new Pokemon tool card we're getting in the set. When it's attached to a Fire Pokemon and they get attacked, the attacking Pokemon is now burned. Basically, you can see what they're trying to push here. You play a bunch of these Burning Scarves on all of your Arcanines, and they effectively become a 230 HP, one prize Pokemon that can, once you factor in the burn damage, pretty much two-shot most everything in the format, which honestly doesn't sound god-awful. Being Fire type, of course, gives it a number of obvious advantages over other types. Of course, you have Welder, so you can easily get this thing powered up if you choose to. I actually really like the fact that it does have a colorless energy, because that does open you up to playing something like Capture Energy, or maybe like Weakness Guard Energy, or Recycle Energy, or something like that if you need to as well. There's even the Arcanine back from Unbroken Bonds as well, which is pretty decent. That can accelerate Fire Energy, so maybe you can play that even as like a one of. Hard to say, but I think this Arcanine does have some good things going for it. Like I said, 230 HP on a one prizer that can hit Zacian for weakness and can two-shot basically everything else in the format. I think that's cool. Now, I do think the big downside to this card coming into Rebel Clash, though, is the fact that we're getting Tool Scrapper reprinted, and suddenly tool cards are going to be a little less safe, meaning as soon as they play Tool Scrapper, this thing gets minus 100 HP, which feels really bad. But on the flip side of that, we have Lana's Fishing Rod, so that there is a way to get your tool cards back, and most decks are only going to play one Tool Scrapper, maybe two, depending on the deck. But overall, I think this Arcanine does have some cool things going for it. So, Xander, I mean, you know me, I'm a sucker. I always get baited into liking these sort of like one prize Pokemon that are evolutions. What do you think about Arcanine here?
The problem that we've said with basically every single one prizer, and we will continue to say with prizers throughout this video, is that they just have lots of resources to do not a ton of damage, and they just die really quickly, and you have to do that over and over again. And this Arcanine gets around that with Burning Scarf. You're still two-shotting stuff. That's no different. That's fine. But having 230 HP is a real big number whenever, like, decks are able to do 230, but they have to commit a fair bit. And committing all that over and over again to take one prize does add up. And I don't think decks are going to play more than 2 Tool Scrapper. So if you're kind of chaining these Arcanines with the Lana's Fishing Rod combination, I think that it actually is pretty viable. Having the other Arcanine to accelerate energy into play on a turn that you don't need to use a Arcanine with a Burning Scarf is really helpful, because it kind of helps you powers up your next Arcanine, so you can maybe not have to find a Welder immediately on the turn. The biggest problem that I see with this deck is that it is going to be very reliant on Welder, because if you power Pokemon and you Arcanine, you attack them, and then they go Tool Scrap or Knockout, you're stuck, and you have to find a Welder immediately again. And so I think that there's a Salazzle with Roast Reveal that's in Standard. There's still Cincino. There are some random options of stuff that you can play. But I do think that this card is good. 130 over and over again doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you have a 230 HP Stage 1 that's doing it, is a lot better.
So, yeah, I really do like Arcanine here, but I think the big reservations I have ultimately when deciding on an actual rating for this card is the fact that we have Tool Scrapper being brought back into the format. And also, I think a deck like this might struggle to find a turn to play Boss's Orders, just because you are very reliant on Welder. Now, granted, I do know that Burning Scarf is going to maybe save you from a one-hit knockout on certain turns, and that might open you up to using some sort of Gust effect. But I think with Boss Orders now being, I think, the best form of Gust, if we can't make use of that, I think we're at an inherent disadvantage compared to other decks in the format that can find turns to use a card like that. So those are some of my concerns. Like, I'm leaning towards saying this card is good, but I think those two factors are making me a little bit hesitant when jumping on that positive rating. So I think I'm going to remain a little bit neutral, but also kind of cautiously optimistic. I think the card is cool, has a lot going for it, but I think my gut tells me those two factors might be a bit of an issue from time to time for the deck.
Yeah, and also to almost rival your point about Boss's Orders, if Boss's Orders is really good against you too, like if they can't knock out the Pokemon in the active, like in a way, Boss's Orders kind of becomes a tool scrapper because they're able to take their one prize and go with it, and then in another turn they can just find the tool scrapper that they need and then knock out the one that you were attacking with. At the end of the day, I think I'm going to be more neutral on it too. I know that we kind of flip flopped back and forth about this one, so sorry if that's confusing. But admittedly, I just forgot the tool scrapper was coming back.
Next up, guys, we have ourselves a Magmortar. Magmortar, of course, is a Stage 1 Pokemon. This one has 140 HP. Water Weakness, 3 Retreat, has 2 different attacks. The first of which is for a Fire and Colorless, does 30 damage. Your opponent's active is now burned. Not too special, but the second attack is where this card gets a lot more interesting. The second attack for 2 Fire and a Colorless says each player discards a card from the top of their deck. This attack does 80 plus 100 more damage for each energy card discarded in this way. So this attack is a lot more interesting than the burn attack, and that's because we actually do have a couple of decent ways at manipulating the top decks of both our deck and our opponents. So of course the obvious combo card here is going to be the Oranguru we got in Sword and Shield. We can easily just put a Fire Energy on top of our deck with Oranguru, discard it, but we also do have a couple ways at manipulating our opponent's top deck as well. Of course there are sort of more random cards like Chip Chip Ice Axe or Hiker. But there's actually a new Clefable in this set that whenever you evolve into it allows you to put an energy from your opponent's active on top of their deck, which can fulfill the other 100 damage. So if you can do this, you can actually do 280, which is a very, very relevant number to hit for with this thing, since that knocks out all of the tag teams that are relevant in the game. And of course will allow you to one-shot things like Zacian and other Fire Weak Pokemon, and two-shot some of the VMAXs. So I think this is cool. You can obviously just welder and power this thing up. I think the issue this Magmortar deck idea might have, though, is that you need welder every turn, and you also need Clefable every turn if you do want to hit the magic 280 number. So that's where I think things get a little bit sketchy with this. But I don't think running 2 stage 1s is out of the question. I don't think that's a big consistency nerf of any kind, really. Oranguru actually increases your consistency as well, which is cool. So I think there are ways to build around this, but I'm a little bit skeptical of how combo-oriented this deck seems to be.
I think that a card that would naturally pair would be Magcargo GX, because Magcargo GX and Magcargo give you more chances to put stuff on the top of your deck, and then maybe that's a way that you don't have to rely that much on Welder. The good thing about Oranguru is that you kind of only need one Oranguru, and then maybe a second one if you're trying to net acceleration on the board. Like you want one to make sure that you're doing the extra 100 from your attack, and then you want a second one to make sure that they are going to be, or that you can accelerate energy into play. The problem with playing all that stuff and Oranguru is that you don't have room for the Clefable package, so maybe Chip Chip Ice Axe is good enough. I believe that decks play enough energy that could be justifiable. Ice Axe being like a plus power for 100 damage does seem pretty good, so I think that you could really make it work. But is this better than the regular Magcargo deck that can just put a bunch of energy into play with welders and with the stacking the top of its deck? And then is that deck even better than the normal fire deck that doesn't have to work clunky combo stuff? I don't know, and I don't think so, because you're having to put a lot of effort into getting 3 energy onto a stage 1 that can die really easily, just to also have to put an energy on top of each player's deck to try to not knock out all of the VMAX Pokemon.
Yeah, and also too, like with fire Pokemon, I feel like we say this every set review, but if you're a fire Pokemon that can use Welder, you have a lot of very good cards to compete with, especially even in the one prize category. Not only the Arcanine we just talked about in this set, but also, of course, we have Baby Blacephalon, which attacks for the same attack cost, that has an unlimited damage cap. And I think it's much easier to get Baby Blacephalon up and running than something like this. I think you actually can successfully build around this and get like a working Magmortar deck up and going. I don't think that's going to be the issue. I think this just might ultimately be overshadowed by all of the other very good fire cards that exist in the format. So while I think I do want to give this a neutral rating, I think the quality of other fire Pokemon is so strong that might push this to not really seeing play. So I might give it a bad rating. Not because it's a bad card, because I think, again, you can successfully get a Magmortar deck up and running. I just think it might just be overshadowed by other stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. Looking in a vacuum versus looking in context are two different things. In a vacuum, this is probably a neutral, but in terms of actual play, it's probably a bad.
Alright guys, next up we have the next of the Galarian starter evolutions. That is going to be Cinderace VMAX. So of course, before we get to the VMAX, let's take a look at the base form Cinderace V. It's a Pokemon V, 210 HP, water weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. Has this ability, if there's a stadium card in play, this Pokemon has no retreat cost. And then its only attack here for 2 fire and a colorless does 140. And looking ahead to the Cinderace VMAX, 320 HP, water weakness to retreat, and its first attack for a fire and colorless does 30, plus does additional damage equal to the amount of damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon during your opponent's last turn. And then its second attack for two fire and a colorless does 170, and your opponent's active is now burned. So definitely a few things to go over with each of these. One of the things I will point out that I do really like about the base form Cinderace is the ability. I think this is really cool because no doubt you're going to be playing copies of Giant Hearth already or Heat Factory, and being able to maybe just, if you are unfortunate enough to start with this, you can just freely retreat into your Jirachi and go for a quick Stellar Wish. So it kind of actually increases your outs to starting with a way to easily Stellar Wish on your turn. Its attack not too great, but the Cinderace VMAX, I think the attack here that really makes this card, I think something worth experimenting with, is counter the first attack. So one thing I really like about this, in particular with the way this attack is worded, is that it's not based on the amount of damage counters that are on Cinderace VMAX. It's just based off of the damage that was done to it, which means you can actually play things like Mallow and Lana or Hyper Potion and heal off some of that damage and still do the same damage to your opponent's Pokemon. I think that's really, really cool. And with power creep in Pokemon and how cards just keep getting stronger and stronger, counter becomes, I think, a increasingly good attack as time goes on. So I think that's, for me, is really where I think I will be most excited about with experimenting with this card. I think the other attacks are fine. You can easily power them up with Welder, but I think counter is really the star of the show here. What do you think, Xander?
Yeah, I think that the second attack is just fine. Like, it will two-shot. There's nothing more to say about it. You use it with Welder, it'll two-shot, it's fine. You'll one-shot basic two-prize Pokemon almost all the time, with the exception of the ones that are past 200 now, which I guess is actually more. You'll one-shot, like, the Datanays and the Eldegosses and the Zacians of the world with this attack, but you're two-shotting all of the VMAXs. But counter is really good, especially with Hyper Potion, because let's say that you Welder onto Cinderace, and you have 3 energy on you, you use Grand Fireball. They hit you, you Hyper Potion, you discard 2 of the energy, and then you only have to attach 1 more energy to use counter, and most likely knock them out. So then you have a healed, partially healed Cinderace, and you can either attach again to use Grand Fireball if you need to, or you have 2 energy on there, so you can retreat to another Cinderace VMAX, so you can play a Welder and attach, and then have a fresh, completely new one. The way that the energy costs are lined up is actually really good. Like what Eric said, because the Cinderace V's ability is relatively good, you can still play like a Jirachi engine and stuff in this deck so that you're able to find the Welder combos that you need more often. And you're actually incentivized to play more Giant Hearts because they're going to help you get the Cinderace out of the active so you can use your Jirachis. Like, it mutually is synergistic. Cinderace V, while very similar to Rilla Boom in that it's not that interesting, is pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, Cinderace, it's also good. Just it gets all of the different fire support, like we mentioned with Welder, with Giant Hearth, Heat Factory, even the Ninetales. I know we have the Boss's Orders being printed in the format after this set comes out, so I know there's some incentive to use that. But with you only relying on your 2 energy attack most of the time, I actually think that does free up some energy to be able to use with the Nine Temptations, Ninetales as your primary like gusting source. So that is an option I like to allow you to still Welder and Gust in the same turn. Just a lot of good things with Cinderace. I think with fire Pokemon in general, it's like you're automatically better than most cards just because of the surrounding cards related to the type. But Cinderace I think is really cool, and I think is a pretty solid card. I like this one. Alright guys, so next up we have Galarian Mr. Rime. So this is going to be a stage 1, 110 HP, metal weakness, 1 retreat cost, and it has this ability, as long as this Pokemon is in play, prevent effects of opponent's attacks done to all of your Pokemon with energy attached to them, and this does not remove any existing effects. Then it has just kind of a generic attack here for a water and colorless. You flip 3 coins, that's 50 for each heads. So of course the main target of this discussion is definitely going to be this ability. And we've seen this ability, throughout the Pokemon TCG before. I think one of the more recent Pokemon that had this was the Espeon back from Dark Explorers. Not that that's super recent, but that's definitely one of the ones I could think of off the top of my head. And I will say, Espeon saw very, very fringe amount of play, and Galarian Mr. Rime could wind up being in the same boat. This is really only as good an ability as the quality of effects that are being placed on your Pokemon by your opponent's attacks. So if you're wondering the types of things this will prevent against, this isn't going to prevent damage, but it will prevent your opponent from, placing status conditions on your Pokemon. It'll prevent them from using something like the attack on Wobbuffet V that moves damage counters onto your opponent's active. Stuff like that. Anything that's not doing direct damage, even placing damage counters, that is an effect of an attack as well. So there definitely can be strong things you might want to prevent against. I could see maybe a deck that gets railed by like Espeon Deoxys as an example, or anything that can manipulate damage counters, might be considering something like this in the future. Off the top of my head, Xander, I don't know if there's anything that's super dominant right now Galarian Mr. Rime here would instantly need to be thrown into a deck for.
I agree, but for as long as Ditto Prism is in standard, this is a card worth considering. I'm still going to give it a fat neutral because I don't really know what I want to be playing this in. It's kind of one of those things that, like, once I see what I need to beat, I'll be like, okay, I know that Galarian Mr. Rime is in standard. If you're thinking about the grander implications of this, I think that for expanded, I don't know if this is better than Galarian Rapidash, which both of them can be used to kind of fight the same thing, being special conditions. But the Shocklock deck that you would play Galarian Rapidash for does not affect you with an attack. It affects you with an ability to get you the paralysis. And so this does absolutely nothing against that deck. So I think that Galarian Rapidash, while it is a lot less useful against the broad metagame, is a better targeted tech for what you're trying to beat. The Espeon was used for stuff like Excelgor, and this is probably better than that because I don't believe that like the Espeon had less HP and I believe a worse retreat cost, if I'm correct. I'm like 99% certain it had a 2 retreat cost. But yeah, I think this card is like solid in a vacuum where we know that there's something specific that we need to beat. And right now, I just don't feel like I'm in that situation. So I'm at a neutral for it.
Yeah, I'm right there smack dab in the middle. There definitely are things that this ability can be good against. Again, it's really just only as good as the quality of effects that are running around in the format. So I'm right there with you, Xander, smack dab in the middle on Galarian Mr. Rime here. Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon V that's going to be Milotic V. It's a basic with 210 HP, lightning weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. Has 2 different attacks here, the first of which for a water and 2 colorless. Does 10 plus 50 more for each energy in your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost. And its second attack for a water and 3 colorless does 150, and your opponent's active is now asleep. So I gotta say, I'm kind of hype about this Milotic here because I don't know how long y'all have been following this channel, but you guys probably know I'm a big fan of the Tangrowth deck. That was a rogue I helped popularize a little bit earlier this season. And it's basically kind of the same thing as this. Not quite as strong, but of course it was a stage 1 prizer instead. But nevertheless, same sort of strategy here. Now we have a basic that does a similar thing and actually can hit even harder. Just with being able to play things like Absols to increase your opponent's retreat cost to do large amounts of damage. But we actually get the new Galar Mine Stadium card in this set as well, which can also increase your opponent's retreat cost, actually both players' retreat cost by 2. So I think that's really how you're going to build around this. You're really not going to use this second attack, rarely if ever. I think you're basically just trying to increase that retreat cost and take huge one-hit KOs with this first attack. So if we run through the math here, if your opponent has a 2 retreat cost, just as an average, and you have 2 Absol in play, you're already hitting 200, or 210 I should say. And then with 1 Galar Mine on top of that, you can actually hit 310, knocking out any tag team in the format. And also, if you want to get a 3rd Absol in play, you can even knock out VMAXs that have a 2 retreat cost or more too. So I think the damage from this actually scales very, very quickly. And the fact that we have a Stadium card that can help fulfill this instead of just relying on 4 Absols in play or something wild like that, I think is actually really, really good. There's a couple different ways I think you can power this up. This is water type, so of course you have access to Frostmoth, but I personally don't think that's the most efficient way to power this up. just because, especially if you're playing Galar Mine as well, needing to be on the bench to accelerate energy and then retreat into your Milotics just doesn't seem like a great way to get going. I think the more likely of options are going to be maybe actually even Welder, just because this is colorless energy by and large that we need for this attack. So I think you can go that route, or even you can go the ADP route. Xander pointed out to me there's been a few decks in Japan going the ADP route, so that also seems really good since ADP, of course, uses water energy for Altered Creation GX. You know, Xander, I don't really see too many bad things to complain about with this card. Is there anything I'm missing? It just seems overall really, really solid.
No, I agree, and I think that a lot of these damage by retreat Pokemon have just required too much stuff to set up. Like, there have been a lot of different cards like this before, and there have been cards that enable it, like the Alolan Dugtrio and Team Aqua Secret Base and stuff like that. But this Milotic, they gave it all the tools that it needs. Galar Mine is a huge addition. It's just a stadium that's a 100 damage plus power. You'll play that basically every time, and it's very inconvenient for stuff like Jirachi. So they cannot skateboard out of that no matter what. So that's really good in messing up the other deck's game plans. But then on top of that, Absol is a card that a lot of decks are playing anyway. Also similarly for Jirachi, but just because it's very good. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, for the most part, you're not having to put bad cards into your deck to make this work. Whereas in the past, you've had to play a lot of stuff that's really inconvenient. And as we get Tool Scrapper soon enough, you can even get rid of pesky skateboards and air balloons and stuff that are going to be messing up your math. So I think the Milotic V is actually pretty good. Not a whole lot to say about it past the main decks that you mentioned that it would be in, but I do think that this is going to be a consideration for a metagame where tag teams, their average retreats like somewhere between 2 to 3, leaning closer towards 3 for the relevant ones. And then VMAXs, their retreats are pretty much the same.
Yeah, I think if there's anything to kind of complain about, though, it might be the weakness, just because Pikarom, especially since Sword and Shield has gotten a pretty big boost, and Pikarom actually gets a really big new special energy in the set, as well as, of course, we have Toxtricity VMAX coming out in the same set as well. So there's definitely some lightning Pokemon that could be a little sketchy for Milotic to be staring down. Other than that, I have to say I'm a big fan of this card. I really like this. I think it's one of the better cards we've looked at so far. Next up, guys, we have the last of the Galarian starter VMAXs. This time it's going to be Inteleon VMAX. But of course, let's take a look at Inteleon V before we get too deep into its final evolution here. So it's going to be a basic Pokemon V, 200 HP, lightning weakness to retreat. Has 2 different attacks, the first of which is going to be a water energy, does 40 to one of your opponent's Pokemon, and second attack for 2 water and colors does 130. Your opponent reveals their hand. Nothing too special here, but let's take a look at the VMAX. Same attack cost for both attacks, the first of which does 60, and you may return an energy card from your opponent's active to their hand. And then its second attack, again, same attack cost as its pre-evolution, 160. This attack does 60 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So I think both these attacks are interesting. Of course, the first one is actually, I think, a solid single energy attack. Just 60, return an energy. Sometimes I think might be disruptive enough to buy yourself a turn without getting swung on. And I really like the fact that the second attack has a 60 snipe, because so frequently that is going to be the amount of HP that some of the basics running around in the format have, like Ditto, Inkay, etc. So this actually could be a really oppressive attack against a lot of the like single prize decks if they do see some play. But Tinder, I know you had some thoughts on Inteleon, so I'm going to pass this one over to you.
Yes, I definitely like the disruptive elements of this card. Between the attack returning an energy to their hand and Team Yell Grunt being able to return energy and Crushing Hammer existing, you definitely have a solid game plan for just trying to deal with as many of their energies as possible. And then if they try to start powering up stuff on the bench, we now have Boss's Orders, so we can bring that up to their active, get rid of the energies there. And then this attack, the second attack, the 160 snipe 60, if they do take an early knockout, you could, like, if you're using Hydro Snipe, the first attack, you can just attach another water, attach a counter gain, and then you're good to go. So I do think that there is some merit to this card just being like a kind of slow, grindy, like, I'll win the game when I get there. This might end up not being a good best of 3 deck as a result. Like, if you lose game 1, you might just lose the entire series. So I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. I mean, if you want to just play a straight Inteleon deck, you can still play like the Drizzle and the Inteleon and search your deck for even more of those trainers to help disrupt your opponent's energy. So I do think there's something here.
Out of all 3 of the Galarian starter VMAXs, this is the one I'm most unsure about how I feel, whereas I think the Rilla Boom and Cinderace are very just like they're how you build around them is, I think, very blatant and obviously like solid to some degree. But this is one that I think could go a bunch of different ways. You could like power this up with Frostmoth if you really want to. Like you said, you can play the normal Inteleon line to find all of your hammers and yell grunts. You could just go in with manual attachments and counter gain if you want to, just because a lot of times Hydra Snipe plus maybe one Hammerheads might be enough to buy yourself a turn. And, if you're going against a deck that is relying on multiple manual attachments, then, Inteleon could end up being pretty good. Now, of course, there are some decks that do have energy acceleration that might kind of annoy you. Like, of course, Pikarom is going to be, I think, kind of an issue for you. I mean, not only are you weak to lightning, but if they just get off one full blitz, I mean, that's really all they need because they can just stack their energy. We have Welder still in the format, of course, that can get down some energies again. But as you guys can see, I think there's a lot to consider for this card, and I just don't really know how I feel about this. This is one of those cards, I think I really just need to get in some games with it and see how it plays out. Like, I think I can only theory mon so much with this. I think I just want to get in some games first, decide how I feel, but I think this card is solid, just I don't know to what degree. Alrighty guys, so next up we have another Pokemon beat. This is going to be Eiscue V. So Eiscue V, of course, is a basic Pokemon, 210 HP, Meta Weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. Has this ability whenever you attach a water energy from your hand to this Pokemon during your turn, heal 30 damage from this Pokemon. And then its only attack for 2 water and a colorless, does 120, and this attack does 10 damage to each of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So I have to say, I think this is one of the more lackluster Pokemon V we've looked at so far. It has this interesting healing ability, but 210, as sad as it is to say, is just going to get nuked a lot of time. We have, of course, Zacians running around everywhere. We have things like Baby Wilcephalon that have unlimited damage caps, etc. This guy is not going to survive enough to actually get benefit from this ability. I think the only situation I could see for this is like, let's say hypothetically some sort of Frostmoth deck does start to eventually see play. I think this could be a decent option to go against single prize decks, as you can just attach as many water energies as you want to heal 30 over and over and over in a turn. So like, let's say you're going against like Malamar, just as an example, Giratina hits you, you can, they're only going to hit you for 130. So from there, you can just pile on a bunch of energy, heal that off, and just use this as like your anti-single prize sort of attacker here. Even still, you're only doing 120. You're not really one-shotting anything. You're not even two-shotting a lot of things in the format. The 10 damage spread isn't that great either. I think the only situation I can think of where this spread damage matters is if like you're playing maybe Alolan Sandslash GX in the same deck as this, as some sort of water like Frostmoth spread deck maybe. I don't know. You guys can see I'm kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel to figure out uses for this thing. Xander, is there anything I might be missing? But this just seems kind of bad to me.
No, but I didn't really think about the implication of attaching a bunch of energy from your hand to this with Frostmoth. But the problem that I see is that if you want this to take the hit, you put energies on it, then they hit you and you don't die. And then you have to retreat into another ice. You have to power up another Eiscue, retreat to that Eiscue, and then attach more energy to this Eiscue so that you can heal the damage. And I just don't see any of that working. And maybe if this was a non-V Pokemon that we could use Scoop Up Net with, so that we could just like it have much less HP, but then it wouldn't be getting knocked out. It'd be getting knocked out easier, but like maybe if you take the hit, you can still return it and do the same thing. I don't know, but I don't see this card being that great. Even if you could power it up reliably, the attack isn't really getting there, and then the ability is not helping much either because you're probably just going to get knocked out by stuff. So, not a huge fan overall.
Yeah, big thumbs down for me. Alrighty guys, up next we have another stage 2 that is going to be Luxray, and much like with the Ludicolo we looked at earlier in this set review, we also do need to look at Luxio. This is another one of those cards that has the top entry ability. So of course, before we talk about Luxray, let's take a look at this Luxio. 90 HP, Fighting Weakness 1 Retreat, has an attack, just a Lightning for 30, but more importantly, this ability, like I said, it's top entry. If you draw this card from your deck at the beginning of your turn and there is room on your bench, instead of putting it into your hand, you may play it directly onto your bench. So of course, this is going to be a way we can cheat our evolutions into play sometimes, especially if we are playing a Rangaroo in our deck. But taking a look at Luxray here, it's a stage 2, 160 HP, Fighting Weakness 1 Retreat, has this attack for a Lightning Energy to 60, If this Pokemon evolved from Luxio during your turn, this attack does 100 more damage, and its second attack for a Lightning and Colorless just does a flat 120. I think definitely the first attack is where this card potentially shines, hitting 160 for 1. Pretty solid. That's going to two-shot basically everything in the format outside of some of the VMAXs, but they're only a damage modifier away from being knocked out by this thing. But of course, the big downside to this is that you do have to evolve from Luxio in particular, and I think that might be where this card gets held back a little bit. I kind of wish this read, if this Pokemon evolved during your turn, this attack does 100 more damage, because then that would open you up to using Rare Candy to evolve from Shinx. But this is going to force you to go through a stage 1, which is a lot clunkier, a lot slower. Now, granted, we do have the Oranguru, and we also have Magcargo in format as well, if we do want to abuse this ability on Luxio. But nevertheless, you have to think this is going to be a clunky sort of effect that we have here. But I will say this, one thing that is nice is that there isn't even a whole lot of pressure to build your deck in a way to keep reusing this attack. Just because if your opponent doesn't knock you out, you can actually use the second attack. I think it's a perfectly fine attack, especially if you've already done 160. Following that up with 120 isn't that bad. That can set yourself up for a two-shot as well. And the one thing I really do like about this card in particular is the fact that it can abuse the new Speed Lightning Energy that's coming out in this set, which we'll talk about towards the end of this set review. But it's a Lightning Energy. When you attach it to a Lightning Pokemon, you get to draw 2 cards in the process. So that's actually really sick for a stage 2 deck. You need all of the consistency boosting effects that you can possibly get. And speaking of which, we also still have the Shinx in format that allows you to evolve on the first turn if you're going second. So I think there's a lot of pieces in play to help make this potentially work.
I think that similarly to what we said about Ludicolo, building this as its own deck might not be the strongest thing. Just trying to get this to happen over and over again, especially with how Raid works specifically, I don't think is great. I think what could be good, kind of like how I mentioned a 0-2-2 and something that wants to take a knockout, is like a 0-2-2 and Pikarom with this seems really good. Because if you're playing, I don't think Oranguru is a bad card to force into your deck to play a combo like this. Is let's say that you miss the turn 1 full blitz, you put a Luxio into play on turn 2, you full blitz, you power up another attacker, then on your next turn, you retreat into Luxio, evolve into Luxray, attach, and then you're knocking out the thing that the Pikarom just hit, and then you still have all the rest of your energies on board. I think that like this feels to me like a better spot than that Electros that the deck was playing, because it definitely is going to have more relevant math. 160 is a lot bigger than I believe. It's either 100 or 130 that the Electros did. And I think the condition with Oranguru is easier to meet as well. So I do like this card. I think in terms of its own deck, it does not seem great in comparison to some of the other stuff that's around. But I think that teching this in something that's already playing Lightning Energies seems really strong, just because 160 for 1 is an incredible rate. I don't think you're sacrificing too much of your deck to make this happen.
See, I actually think I might disagree with that, because you're effectively committing 4 slots in your deck, whereas if you're just playing Electros, it's just a 1 of. And so I think that's going to be a little bit more consistent. You're going to have a lot of these Luxury pieces kind of floating around in your deck that are going to go unused. And I think specifically in Pikarom, if you're playing something like this, it would be probably to deal with Obstagoon. But I think Electros already can pretty easily deal with Obstagoon, because Obstagoon's not putting on a lot of pressure very early on, so you can get the energy needed in play to use Electros, and then you're just 1 damage modifier away from knocking out an Obstagoon. So I think that's going to be a lot more consistent. Like, I actually don't think I would play this in Pikarom, just because of how much deck space it would force. Like, I think if I'm building around this, I would probably prefer just to build it on its own. But that also has issues with it as well, like we've kind of said, because this is contingent on evolving from Luxio specifically. I think if this was just evolve at all, even from Shinx, we might have a different story on our hands. But I still like this card. You have Electro Powers. You can even play things like Giant Bomb if you want to get around things like ADP, taking multiple prizes on you at a time. So I think there's a lot to like, but there are definitely some things I think holding this back. So I'm personally going to be a bit neutral on this one.
Yeah, I'll be neutral also, just because I don't see it working well as an individual deck. And all the same arguments about Reset Stamp, messing up the top of your deck, and Marnie and stuff like that all still apply.
Next up, guys, we have another Stage 2 Lightning Pokemon. This one is going to be Vikavolt. So Vikavolt has 150 HP, Fighting Weakness, and a 2 retreat cost, and it has 2 different attacks here. So the first of which for a Lightning and 2 Colorless to 60, and then 20 more times the amount of energy attached to all of your Pokemon. And then its second attack for a Lightning and 3 Colorless does 170, and this Pokemon does 30 to itself. if we're going to be talking about this, there's definitely some things we have to keep in mind. Of course, we have to keep in mind all of the existing lightning sort of utility cards like Electro Power, Tapu Koko, Thunder Mountain. Those are the given ones. But we also have to remember we have the Charge-a-Bug back from Unbroken Bonds that can attach itself as a double lightning to any of your Vikavolt. And that's where I think this card starts to get very interesting. Now, of course, we had the old Vikavolt. You know, I actually did play a lot with back during the Unbroken Bonds format that can do a similar amount of damage. But I think where this card gets more interesting is the fact that we don't have to discard Charge-a-Bugs every turn to do large amounts of damage. We can just dump all of our Charge-a-Bugs in play because they don't count as your attachment for turn. And then from there, we can actually throw down things like triple acceleration energy or twin energy to increase our damage even more because it doesn't require lightning energy. It specifies any of your energy in play. So I believe Xander pointed out to me if we have all of our Charge-a-Bugs in play, we didn't prize any, we're going to be hitting for 220. And then if we have just one triple acceleration energy from there, that's going to be 280. And that's without any Electro Powers or any other modifiers or anything like that. So I think you can actually pretty convincingly take a knockout on tag teams and maybe even beyond. And I think debatably even more efficiently than the old Vikavolt, just because you aren't having to discard your Charge-a-Bugs every time you attack. I think the old Vikavolt is already kind of a decent stage 2 that we have in the format, but I think this might even be a direct upgrade. You know, not having any abilities also means you can play something like greens if you do want to go that route. But I think also you can probably just play this with a normal Jirachi engine, some rare candies, and, you know, kind of call it a day that way as well. But I have to say, I actually do like this card. This is definitely a card I want to build around. Definitely, I think, one of the better stage 2s we've looked at this far. But Xander, what do you think here about Vikavolt?
I think it's pretty good, and the potential for the late game does get better, where once you kind of have one or two Vikavolts out, you've kind of done your job, and then the energies do stay in play as comparison to before where they wouldn't. So I'm not entirely sure how reliably you can get all of that going. The Charge-a-Bug that is the one that attaches itself as an energy is a lightning type, so you can't use like Turf Field to kind of get that out of your deck. That would be nuts if you could. I think that you just have to find so many Pokemon to get the ball rolling that you might end up behind by the time that you're set up. So I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. Maybe you play a few lightning energies just so that you don't have to use your like 2 Charge-a-Bugs on your active every single turn. I'm scratching my head real hard trying to figure this out. I think it's decent. I'll give it a neutral, but it's not the deck that I think I'm going to be putting a lot of time into trying to figure out how good it is.
Well, you also have to think, Xander, if you are indeed playing something like triple acceleration in this deck, all you need is one Charge-a-Bug, and then if you don't have your other Charge-a-Bugs in play yet, you can just, you know, I'm just going to attach a triple, hit for 170 with the second attack, go for the 2-shot, and I think a lot of times that's going to be fine. The 30 damage it takes is irrelevant most of the time since you're just going to get one-shotted anyways. And, you know, now that Sword and Shield brought us a lot of great search cards like Evolution Incense, I think this actually, you know, is going to set up pretty decently. I think there's even an argument to be made. You can maybe even try to play this with Inteleon. That's kind of a route I wouldn't mind going because if you do go the heavy stage 2 engine here with Inteleon and Vikavolt, that actually opens you up to using Super Boost Energy Prism Star, which is effectively a plus 80 just sitting on your board, and you can have that on any of your Pokemon just sitting there as kind of like perpetual plus 80 if you do want to build around that engine. So I think there's a lot of different ways to get this powered up, and I think it does have the tools to get going. I think the only downside to it is just the fact that it's the stage 2, and it's kind of hindered by just the natural issues that most stage 2 decks in general have. Also, I will say this, guys, you know, I'm always a sucker for stage 2s and one prizers, so maybe take what I say with a grain of salt sometimes, but I do genuinely like this Vikavolt. I think since it has an unlimited damage cap, an easy way to get powered up, and plenty of different engines to potentially make use of, I think there's enough here to stand beside this card. Next up, we have another Pokemon V we're going to be talking about. That's going to be Boltund V. So Boltund here is a basic with 200 HP, has fighting weakness, 2 retreat cost, has 2 different attacks, the first of which is a lightning energy. Search your deck for up to 2 lightning energy and attach them to your bench Pokemon any way that you like, then shuffle your deck. Then its second attack for a lightning and colorless is 10 plus 30 more damage for each lightning energy attached to your Pokemon in play. So I think this card is really interesting. Actually, when I first saw this, I was like, this seems kind of mediocre. But the more I think about it, the more applications I think there are. You can see both attacks synergize with itself very, very nicely. Use this Electrify attack. Every time you use that, that's effectively like a plus 60 you're doing Xander, I'll pass this one over to you. I remember you liked Bolton's here.
Yeah, I think the card does a few things that not a ton of stuff in its position does. I like it in the Pikarom deck just as a one of, so that you aren't having to go crazy and commit to the turn one full blitz. And then the second attack, a low energy commitment to take an easy knockout, maybe even on something like a Jirachi, where you're obviously going to be knocking it out just based on the energy that you have on the Bolton. It's just like a low resource threat to kind of do some of the little stuff that you need to do. And I think at the cost of just one card, it's not that punishing. But outside of that, I don't really know where this card shines. I know you had a few more ideas, so I'll send it back to you about that. But I just think that your damage cap doesn't scale excellently into the late game, so you kind of want to use it as this little early game threat. But I know you had some more thoughts about that.
Yeah, so specifically in Pikarom, real quick, I'll add on to what you're saying. I think there's a case to be made for it, but at the same time, like, I don't think it's super great as well. Like, I think if you're not taking a one-hit KO, I think you'd rather be full blitzing most of the time, or going in with Raichu Low and Raichu and paralyzing them and potentially not getting swung back on. But the fact that you're a two-prizer instead of a three-prizer does create some incentive. And, even though I think the turn one full blitz is actually, like, fairly easy to pull off in this format, some turns you're not going to hit it, and having an alternate attack to fall back on turn one is pretty nice like this. This can easily set your board up for your full blitz. But even outside of Pikarom, I actually think you can build around just Bolton V. I think we have enough cards right now in the format to sort of enable that. You can kind of play this almost like a two-prize version of the Nuzzle deck with, even though you give up more prizes, your energy acceleration is also your attacker, unlike the Nuzzle deck, and you hit for more damage, obviously, as well. So yeah, you can build around Bolton V just as your main attacker. There's also things like Zeraora GX, not only to give it free retreat, but also to use its GX attack to get 5 energies out of the discard pile. There's Naganadel, obviously from Lost Thunder, to get your lightnings out of the discard whenever Bolton gets knocked out, or you discard them with Quick Ball or Professor's Research. Of course, we have Speed Lightning Energy, which is something we have to keep in mind for all of these different lightning Pokemon we're going to be talking about to boost your consistency. We have Thunder Mountain, Tapped Cocoa Prism, Electro Power, all the other standard lightning cards that are so great. So I think there is a world where I just kind of build around Bolton V and say, hey, I'm going to get a billion lightning energies in play. There's nothing you can do. I'm just going to swing on you and take big one-hit knockouts. So I think that's maybe where I would start playing around with Bolton. Like I said, you can easily throw this into Pikarom if you want to, but I think I'm interested in seeing what I can make happen by building around this. But nevertheless, I still could see a world where this sees play no matter what, just as a one-of in Lightning decks, whether it's Pikarom, maybe even something like Toxtricity V, whatever it might be, just because this is a very low energy attacker, like you pointed out, Xander, compared to the other 3 energy attackers that are primarily most of the prominent lightning attackers we have in the game. So I like this card. Both attacks here are solid enough to where this could see play as both a backup attacker and as a form of early game energy acceleration, especially once Tapped Cocoa Prism and Thunder Mountain rotate this year as well, more than likely. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a Toxtricity card we're going to be talking about. There's a couple in the set, but this is going to be a non-Pokemon V Toxtricity. So it's a Stage 1, 130 HP, Fighting Weakness, 2 Retreat. Has this first attack here for a Lightning Energy. This does 20 to each of your opponent's Pokemon, and your opponent's active is now poisoned. And then its second attack, just a vanilla 90 for 3. So second attack is definitely garbage, but this first one actually is kind of interesting. So this is basically Flying Flip from the Tapu Koko promo that rotated this past year, but with the added effect of poisoning your opponent's active, which is a nice little bonus since you are a Stage 1 instead of just a basic. But I do have to say, I think I like this attack to some degree, just because we have, of course, Speed Lightning Energy, which is great. You can power this thing up with that, draw some cards in the process. We have E-Power as well. Now, the issue with a card like this in Standard, though, is we have ADP. And ADP is just so hard for these types of cards to overcome, because they can just take a knockout on 3 Toxtricities, and you lose the game. And you don't really have a way to really quickly respond to that. There are a few things I think we could mention, like you could play Counter Gain and Mimikyu, and maybe even the new Ninetales we talked about earlier in this set review to knock out Zacian. But I think a deck like that, which is so popular, is going to be a huge issue for something like Toxtricity to overcome. So that's my big reservation for this. and also tag teams are so big and bulky as it is. Your opponent doesn't even really need to bench too many things against you if they're playing a tag team deck as it is. So I think those are the big things in standard that really might end up holding this card back. Xander, do you think this card can actually like cut through the noise here? And we've seen Wheezing and Tapu Koko in the past be good, but I almost feel like the state of standard might be too hostile for this card.
Yeah, I think that this card's a dud, which is really sad because I played multiple 4 Coco decks in the past and felt no shame in doing so. I think that the problem that I see with Toxtricity right now is that you could lose to just a single tag team taking the majority of the knockouts, especially because so many of them get powered up so fast. Like if you're going against Pikarom, for example, they can power up one Pikarom and then take 3 attacks, and then on the turn that they're close to dying, they just bench another Pikarom and accelerate the energy to it, and then you knock them out, sure, but then they just take the rest of their knockouts. And Mewtwo can do that with Welder, and ADP can do that even easier because of all the creation, and there's just so much stuff that they don't have to invest a lot of onboard resources just to take knockout after knockout. And even if you have like counter weakness stuff to kind of take a knockout, they can make a comeback from some of that. So I think overall, I'm not super impressed with Toxtricity on its own because I think that it's very easily played against. And also like 20 damage onto everything now where the high HP is like 260 to 340 is nowhere near the same as when the high HP is like 170 to 240. Like this is 2 completely different ballparks. And at least with GXs with Tapu Koko, you could get them before they evolve, or you could use Espeon EX to de-evolve them so you didn't have to work the whole way. We don't really have any of those tools in standard, so I think Toxtricity really sadly is a big fail for me.
Yeah, I think you're like absolutely dead on the money. Like the 20 spread in like 2017, much more impactful. Where probably the tankiest Pokemon that saw play was like Gardevoir GX with 230 HP that evolved from 60 HP basics. Like that's very different than going against basics with like 280 HP as an example. It's just a lot harder to kind of deal with that. I think again, if this was a couple years ago, this would be a great card, but I think right now the state of standard is just a little too hostile towards Toxtricity. So unfortunately, I'm right there with you. I'm gonna have to pass on this one. Alright guys, next up we have Toxtricity VMAX, one of the big mascot Pokemon of the set. And of course, before we get to that, let's take a look at the base form Toxtricity V we're getting. It's a basic Pokemon, 210 HP, fighting weakness, and 2 retreat cost. For lightning energy does 20, and your opponent's active is now poisoned, and its second attack for 2 lightning and a colorless does 90 plus 90 more if your opponent's active is now poisoned. Important to note since the Toxtricity VMAX does require poison as well. And then for the VMAX, it's going to be a VMAX, of course, 320 HP, fighting weakness, 2 retreat cost, and just has 1 singular attack, much like the second attack on the base form Toxtricity. Does 160 plus 80 more if your opponent's active is poison. So you guys can see the clear theme between both of these cards here. Luckily for us though, there is a new Garbodor coming out in the same set that will inflict poison if there is a stadium card in play. So that's going to be probably the main way we are going to be inflicting this status condition. But it is cool that the base form Toxtricity does inflict poison just for a single energy. That's cool. There is also the promo Toxtricity V, which is also pretty decent. It can accelerate an energy out of the discard pile for 1 energy as well. But I think this is definitely just one of those decks that builds itself. You're going to play a 2-2, maybe a 3-3 Garbodor, some speed lightning energies, Coco Prism, Thunder Mountain, and you're probably like a 3-3, 4-3 Toxtricity V line or something like that. And you're just going to try to nuke everything that gets in your way, basically. So if we run through the math on this second attack, 160 plus 80, it's 240, plus at least 10 from poison is 250. So 1 E-Power is going to knock out any tag team in the format. And of course, you can just 2-shot any of the VMAXs. That's fine. So, Xander, I already kind of outlined, I think, the skeleton of this deck. But is there anything else that could be good to help this thing out?
No, but I do think it's pretty viable. I do see this deck struggling if you get a big knockout on the first Toxtricity VMAX. I just don't know how fast you're setting up the second one because it kind of feels like a lot of your eggs are in one basket. But maybe you play 1 Pikarom in your deck or a Bolton so you can power this stuff up and then not worry about it too much. And then either way, there's the 1 Toxtricity, the Sword and Shield promo that lets you accelerate energy onto it. You do have some different options, just a matter of figuring out which is the best one. But yeah, like you said, the deck builds itself. Like the card is solid, and I don't think it's going to be that inconsistent. Your Garbodor line that you should play is not going to be that thick, and so I think you'll be fine. So yeah, I think it's solid.
I'm right there with you. This is just another one of the VMAXs. I think all of these VMAXs are honestly kind of like the same card in a way. Like they all one-shot tag teams, but then you have to two-shot VMAXs for like, and basically all for a similar energy cost as well. And Toxtricity V is kind of unique in the sense that Lightning has so much great support. So I think that in and of itself kind of makes this card pretty decent. Between Boltund, Thunder Mountain, Tapu Koko Prism Star, Speed Lightning Energy, the promo Toxtricity V, I think there's a lot of ways to get this up and running pretty effectively. If this ever does get popular, you might see something like Galarian Rapidash pop up to try to stop the poison. So that is one unfortunate thing about this card. It's kind of easily teched against. If this does become a very strong force to be contended with in the metagame, like if this becomes a tier 1 deck, I think a lot of decks are just going to start playing Galarian and Rapidash potentially, and it could keep this in check. So that's one thing you do have to be mindful of. But other than that, I think this is definitely still a solid evolution line. Fighting's also not that great at the time of filming. There are some new fighting Pokemon in the set we'll be taking a look at, but I'm not sure if there's anything that's going to be super widespread. But yeah, I think definitely a solid evolution line for sure. Thumbs up for me. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Clefable. This is, I believe, the first of the fairy Pokemon that are getting represented as Psychic in the TCG sets. Something interesting to point out here. So we have Clefable. It's a stage 1, 110 HP, metal weakness, of course, since it is a fairy type, like I just mentioned. 1 retreat cost, and it has this ability: once during your turn, whenever you play this card from your hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may choose an energy attached to your opponent's active and return it to the top of your opponent's deck. And just kind of a vanilla 60 for a Psychic and Colorless. So clearly the ability is the big thing we want to sort of focus in on here. And we've actually mentioned this card a couple times throughout the set review. We looked at the Magmortar earlier in the set review. Clefable pairs very nicely with that. There's also the Inteleon VMAX that is trying to disrupt your opponent's energies. But the big question is, are there any other uses for this card? And are any of these uses that we've mentioned good enough to actually make this card see some play? So, Xander, I know you're more of a control player than I am. I know we had some ideas for something like that. So I'll pass this one over to you.
Yeah, I think that putting energy on top of your opponent's deck, people have always been like, well, that's not that great because they just draw it and attach it the next turn. And where you're not necessarily wrong, it is like a different role to play. If you look at the deck that Sander recently did well with over at Malmo, that deck played a lot of Team Yell Grunts, and it's kind of the same idea. Like, why would you return the energy to their hand? It means that they can just attach it next turn. The idea is that you just want to make the game go long enough that they're not going to beat you fast enough. So I think that this is probably good in the Scoop Up Net control deck that's bound to exist at some point. Scoop Up Net being an automatic super scoop up for non-V, non-GXs. So you can just return it to your hand, then bench the Clefable, and then maybe if you have another Clefable, you get rid of 2 in 1 turn. One thing you can do is you can put it on top, and then you can Bellaba and Bryson Man in the way. Like, that's a combo. We don't have Handiwork in Standard, but Bellaba and Bryson Man has done an excellent job so far at milling people out. I think that it's fine. I like that it kind of plays with energies more than the standard mill deck. A lot of decks right now are not trying to get energies off the board. They're just trying to deck people out as fast as possible, and that doesn't really matter when everything just gets out an attacker and beats all your stuff, and then they don't need any more resources. This forces them to have to go through more of their deck, and then you can mill them out eventually. So I'm going to end up giving it a neutral, not necessarily because I don't think it's good, because I do think it's good, but just because the home is not obvious for where this card goes so far.
So yeah, adding on to that for like a control sort of archetype, I think like if we were going to sort of paint a picture of like what a deck like that might look like, you're probably just playing Clefable with Orangaroos and Crushing Hammers, and basically every turn you're going to get back either Scoop Up Net or Devolution Spray Z, and like Crushing Hammers turn after turn with resource management, and basically just trying to run your opponent out of resources and prevent them from actually being able to attack into you. And then from there, you'll eventually mill them with stuff like Belba and stuff like that. So I think that deck idea seems okay. Control, for better or for worse, has a lot of options at its disposal right now. And it remains to be seen if this kind of outclasses some of the other ways we've seen control decks exist in the Sword and Shield format. I think there are, a number of different applications, but I'm just really not sure if any of these that we've talked about are going to break through right away. But I think its ability is strong enough, and the fact that we have both Devolution Spray Z and Scoop Up Net in the format kind of mean that this card has a chance to see some play, so I'm going to be right there with you in the middle on this thing. Next up, guys, we have Galarian Cursula. So Galarian Cursula here, it's a stage 1 Pokemon, 100 HP, Dark Weakness, Fighting Resistance to Retreat Cost. It has this ability, if this Pokemon is your active and is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, flip a coin. If heads, the attacking Pokemon is knocked out. And then its only attack here for a Psychic and Colorless is 60, and the defending Pokemon can't retreat during your opponent's next turn. I think this card is really, really solid. You know, we've seen this ability in the past. I think one of the more recent ones that had this effect was the Chandelure from Phantom Forces. That one didn't see too much play, but of course, going back to Stormfront, of course, we had Gengar, which was a very dominant card, had a very similar ability, even made its way into our top 10 psychic Pokemon cards of all time that Xander did not too long ago. I'll have a link hopefully on screen somewhere if you guys want to check that out as well. But this ability is super, super strong, especially in a format where we have 3 prize Pokemon. Like, looking back at these other Pokemon that have had this ability, they've only existed where 2 prize Pokemon at max existed. But now we have tag teams that are going to net 1 prize and give up 3 whenever they attack you is absolutely insane. The attack is, like, honestly pretty irrelevant, though I think there is a world where you still might play things like spell tags and or the new horror psychic energy that's coming out in the set, just to maybe pick off another prize on a Jirachi or something like that along the way. Not sure, but this ability is just really, really solid. I think for me personally, the idea that came to my mind first was maybe playing this in Beheeyem and really just hit and run style decks in general. But I like Beheeyem specifically because it does also item lock your opponent at the same time, making it hard for them to find things like Fion, or maybe shutting off their custom catchers or Pokemon catchers, whatever it may be, and basically just item locking them, throwing up your Galarian Cursula, and hopefully netting some additional prizes in the process.
Yeah, I think the hit and run is obvious. I think there are a few weird decks where you can use this with the Shedinja that's in standard, so they don't take prizes when they knock it out, but knock it out to try to end the game to get around it. And then if they do knock it out, then they end up losing like their prizes half the time. Eric mentioned Malamar, and I think that that's decent because you can play things like Giratina so that whenever you do need to actually get the knockout on something, you can just power that up quickly and do it. But I think this card is really solid. Having the ability on a stage 1 instead of a stage 2 is so much easier to get out than a stage 2. You don't have to fiddle around with Rare Candy. You get Ditto Prism as a 5th basic, so you can really play a very thick line of this, and your opponent just has to go through it at some point, and there's not a lot of like spread attackers so that they can kind of knock all of these out at once or pick around on your bench. And though we do have like lots of catchering stuff in standard, if you're in a board state where your whole board is Galarian Cursulas, they are going to have to take a knockout on them at some point.
Oh, and just to kind of build off that too, we've mentioned a couple times, but we do have Scoop Up Net. So if you do want to play some sort of Malamar deck or some way at flooding a bunch of these on board and getting them powered up, you can then kind of pivot into your Scoop Up Nets, pick all of them off the board, and like you said, Xander, just have like basically a giant field of landmines for your opponent to have to try to go through.
The attack making it so they can't retreat, that doesn't sound like a helpful clause, but I think it's a little bit more helpful than you think, because it means that like if they have their attacker active, they cannot retreat into a Jirachi to try to find their catchers, their boss's orders, and stuff like that to really get around this card. So I think this card is definitely going to be a pain in the butt that is very good, just because you're going to be up trading so often. Like if they hit this with a tag team and you hit heads, you took 3 prizes to their 1 prize, so you're half of the way to winning the game, and they're a sixth of the way to winning the game. I think it's really going to force decks to play awkwardly against you, and you're going to get some semi-free wins just based off the nature of coin flips. And while it's not at all a guarantee, I think that this is a coin flip that I'm willing to risk taking. I really like this card, and I think that there's going to be some very degenerate deck that's based around it that I'm going to enjoy and love very much.
There's a lot to say about this card. I really like this. It's definitely among one of my top favorite cards in the set, actually. So it sounds like we're both in agreement. Big fans of the Galarian Cursula. Alrighty, next up, guys, we have a new Sigilif card we're going to be looking at. This is a basic Pokemon, 110 HP, Lightning Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and a 1 Retreat. It has this ability: if this Pokemon is your active and is damaged by an opponent's attack, place 3 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon, and then its attack for a Psychic and Colorless is 30, plus 10 more for each damage counter on the opponent's active Pokemon. So you guys can see the obvious synergy here between both the attack and the ability. Psychic, of course, also has a ton of other synergistic cards. We have Spell Tag in the format. We have the new Horror Psychic Energy we're going to be talking about towards the end of this set review to get some more damage counters in play as well. There's also Giratina still. So a lot of ways to get damage counters and cheat damage counters into play.
So you're playing Malamar, which I'm sorry if you're doing that. But let's say you're playing Malamar and you attack him with a Giratina. Giratina's never going to knock them out because it doesn't do enough damage, right? Giratina gets knocked out. You use Sigilyph, which only requires 1 energy from your discard pile. You can attach the other one from your hand. And then you can use the other Psychic Recharge onto like a Garchomp Giratina or whatever you want to, right? You knock out their Pokemon with this because presumably 130 plus 160 from this is 290, and then Spell Tag or Distortion Door will get you the rest of the way, probably at some point before you're doing this. And then when they knock out the Sigilyph, you bring up a Garchomp Giratina. They already have the 3 damage on them because they knocked out this Pokemon, plus any Spell Tags or Distortion Doors. And so Calamitous Slash already has the damage that it needs to get to the 240 range, and so it makes your knockouts look really easy. Where Spell Tag can be Tool Scrapper and stuff like that, this ends up looking really good as just a one-of. Like, I cannot see a situation you ever play more than one of this. But I think that a one-of for the Malamar deck is good enough.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that makes me actually consider this card is going to be the fact that we are getting Tool Scrapper in the same set, which means normally you would kind of be able to pull off a combo like this via Spell Tag. Now that your opponent has the option to remove that, you're going to need other ways at getting those damage counters on the active for your Tina Chomp to clean up a knockout. So of course you have the Horror Psychic Energy. A lot of Malamar players have been playing Recycle Energy in their list and then just going all in on their basics. So it's hard to say if they'll be able to find room for the Horror Psychics just because you can't recharge them and you don't have like this infinite loop of energy that the Recycle Energy grants you. So I think this is actually a relatively decent way at fulfilling the cost on Tina Chomp that you kind of outlined. So I think this is definitely, a potential one for Malamar. There's not really too many other practical applications I can really see for this. Personally, I'm going to remain a bit neutral on this one, only because Psychic it's another one of those types, like Malamar in particular has this huge toolbox of Psychic attackers to pull from, and you just can't fit all of them in a 60 card list. So I think you really do have to look at all of the options you have and think, am I going to cut my Esper? Am I going to cut my Mimikyu, etc., to find room for Sigilyph? And I'm just not sure. So that's why I'm going to remain neutral in the middle on this one. But the fact that we have Tool Scrapper coming out in the set means that Spell Tags are going to be maybe a little less effective than usual. And that might open up some area of opportunity for Sigilyph to be a nice single slot in your Malamar deck.
I think I'll throw it in neutral, not because it's not good, but just because it doesn't go any farther than the play pattern I think I suggested.
Alrighty guys, next up we have a new Palossand card. Palossand is a Psychic Stage 1, 140 HP, Dark Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and a 4 Retreat cost. And it has 2 different attacks, the first of which is going to be just for 2 colorless energy. Discard a card from the top of your opponent's deck. If this Pokemon has Curse Shovel attached to it, discard 2 more cards. And its second attack for a Psychic 2 colors is 90, heal 30 from this Pokemon. And just to add some context too, if you guys aren't familiar with the Curse Shovel card that's coming out in this set, it's a Pokemon tool card, and it says if the Pokemon this tool is attached to is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, discard the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. So effectively, you're going to be discarding 3 every time you use this, and then every time this gets knocked out, you discard an additional 2. You have, of course, Bellwood Bryson Man to kind of expedite that whole process a little bit as well if you want to. Now, the question, though, is we already have a bunch of really strong control options in the mix. And we have to ask, is this better than any of those existing strategies that we've seen recently?
I think it is actually pretty solid because with Twin Energy allowing you to use this, discarding effectively 5 a turn without any Bellwood Bryson Mans or anything like that, I think this does end up pretty solid. I don't know if this is better than the Cincino deck that is just going to like Surge, Bellwood Bryson Man, especially because Curse Shovel can be attached to any Pokemon. Like imagine having a Lily's Pokédol Curse Shovel on it. That sounds like as cursed as the name intends. I don't know if it ends up being better than the Cincino deck just because the Cincino deck is more consistent. You do have more moving parts to that deck, but since you have Make Do to draw more of your deck, you're going to see more stuff. So I think that the Palossand deck, if it's going to be more successful than that, kind of needs to go at a different angle. You just have to mill them out as fast as you can, but you're trying to chain these Palossands. You're still getting knocked out. You're not setting up Lily's Pokédolls. So maybe you are playing like a Doll Stall deck and you kind of close the game out with Palisand. I feel like I'll give Palisand a neutral, just because I don't know if it's better than some of the control strategies that we see already. But I do think that it's like pretty good. You can probably mill someone out with this card more than some other cards you've seen.
I think this card has enough support. I mean, the entire evolution line is Mysterious Treasure searchable. We have Twin Energy. We also have Triple Acceleration Energy. So there's plenty of ways to get energy down on this thing to get it powered up. Curse Shovel, obviously, with Lana's Fishing Rod to get them back if they ever get tool scrappered or just knocked out from play. Neither the Sandygast or Palisand have an ability, so you can even play greens if you want to go that route, though I think you'll probably prefer something like a Cinccino or some sort of alternate draw engine to ensure that you can play your Belba Bryson Mans for turn. But I think there's a lot of pieces for this that look like they might be able to enable this to be a thing. But I think I'm going to stand with you on this one, Xander. There's a lot of really good control options in the format right now without Palisand. So I'm not sure if this is going to actually trump those. Something to keep in mind, but the card definitely has promise. Next up, guys, we have another Stage 2 Pokemon. This is going to be Hatterene. So it has 150 HP, Dark Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and 2 Retreat. But its ability here says, once during your turn, you may have each player discard one card from their hand. Your opponent discards first. If either player has no cards in their hand, that player does not discard. Then its only attack here for a Psychic Energy, you put damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon equal to the number of Pokemon in your discard pile. So I think this is, at a glance, a really, really cool card. Like, it's Psychic type, which means you have access to Treasure, but you also have access to the new Horror, Psychic Energy, Spell Tag, all these ways to compound your damage output. The ability synergizes really nicely with the attack. The attack cost itself is only a single attachment as well, which is really good for a Stage 2. Like, generally my rule of thumb for Stage 2s is they either need to accelerate energy to themselves or they need just like a single attachment, and this fulfills that. But my issue with this is I just don't think the damage output is quite high enough. This is very similar to other attacks we've seen in the past, like Be Revenge on Vespiquen, back from Ancient Origins. That's probably been the most notable Pokemon kind of this style in recent memory. But as a Stage 2, that does technically less damage than Vespiquen in a format now with Pokemon over 330 HP. I don't know if this attack seems very good. Like, I kind of wish they would have designed this a little bit differently. I wish this was place the damage counters in any way that you would like, or I wish it was like 50 or 60 plus 10. It had this somewhat meaty base damage output. Just because if you have 20 Pokemon in the discard, that's 200, but that's still not even getting a knockout really on anything. And being damage counters as well means you can't even hit things like Mewtwo and Mew for weakness. I think there's a lot of really good aspects about this, but I think this damage is just far too low to be a good card.
And even if the damage was better, is it worth getting a Stage 2 in play to do all of this stuff? As it is right now, you have to do at least 14 Pokemon in your discard pile to kind of get to a 2-shot range. And you're doing that with a Stage 2, mind you, so that's going to be really difficult. What I was thinking was playing something like Shedinja, because whenever you use Shedinja's ability, the Nincada goes to your discard pile. And then whenever you attack with Hatterene, the Shedinja goes to the discard pile, so it's kind of like an extra Pokemon that you get to play for free. And then there's still Zebstrika in Standard that you can use. And then we have Professor's Research, so there are a handful of ways. But I don't know if we're going to be able to get a Stage 2 into play consistently enough to make that happen. So I do think that it could work, but it's a lot of stuff to just be a mediocre Vespiquen deck. So I think I'll sit neutral on it, because thinking about Rosa makes it sound a lot better, but I don't know if that means it's good.
Unfortunately, as much as it pains me to do so, I'm going to actually downvote this one. I think this card is just shy of being actually worth experimenting with. Next up, guys, we have another Stage 2 Psychic Pokemon, and that is going to be Dragapult. So Dragapult, Stage 2, 150 HP, Dark Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and a 0 Retreat. 0 Retreat is always going to be really, really nice. But has this ability, if this Pokemon would be damaged by an attack, flip a coin. If heads, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon. And its only attack here for 2 Psychic Energy is 120, and put 3 damage counters on your opponent's bench Pokemon in any way that you like. So this actually seems like the exact type of card I would be baited into liking. Stage 2, good ability, somewhat manageable attack cost. The attack actually synergizes very nicely with things like Spell Tag and the Horror Psychic Energy as well. So those are the things I do like. I think between all of those different sort of spread mechanisms, you can actually probably net yourself an additional prize at some point throughout the game on something like a Jirachi, and maybe prevent your opponent from trying to force you into like a 7 or 8 prize game. I think where I start to get a little less than excited for is the fact that this is 2 psychic energy. So what I mean by that is you're already a stage 2 deck, you're already committing probably a good amount of deck space to something like this Dragapult line plus some Jirachis. And I think if you want to play something like a Malamar line, I'm not sure if you have enough space to actually fit that in. If this was like Psychic Colors, that would be fantastic because you could play Counter Gain to be able to power up a Dragapult in one turn. So my big fear with the deck is you're going to attack with Dragapult, you're going to flip Tails, it gets knocked out, and then you don't have a Dragapult for the following turn unless you have Malamar as well. And I'm just not sure if you have the physical deck space to be able to run Malamar.
I think the card is fine. I do see where it could be difficult to chain these over and over again, especially if they do flip Tails a few different times. But very similar to how we said that Rosa would really help the Hatterene, I definitely think that it can help this as well, because if you're trying to play Malamar alongside of it, which I think is correct, you can very easily get an energy, Rare Candy, Dragapult, Psychic Recharge and energy onto it. You have Jirachi to retreat, whatnot, so you can still have the Psychic Recharge. So I do think that it ends up being successful. If it were me, I think you can spread that in a way where you can kind of just like end the game in one turn. And I feel like that's a lot of the big success of the deck, is that they're not going to be able to like stamp you to 0 hand and then knock out your Dragapult. So I think that this card is pretty solid, but just consistency with stage 2s is always going to be difficult when we have such good options in standard. And then I don't see how you're 2-shotting VMAXs in any real way. So neutral for me.
I feel like in a vacuum, I agree with you. I think this is a pretty like solid middle of the road card, but I think I'm actually going to downvote this one entirely, and it hurts me to do so because I think this card's actually pretty cool, but it has just enough going against it to where I don't think this will be able to break out and be competitive, unfortunately. So up next, guys, we have ourselves another Dragapult line to talk about, but this time it's going to be Dragapult VMAX. So before we get to the VMAX, let's take a look at the base form. Dragapult V is a basic with 210 HP, Dark Weakness, Fighting Resistance, 1 Retreat. First attack is just a Psychic for 30, and second attack is 2 Psychic, 60 plus 80 if this Pokemon was on your bench and became your active this turn. And then looking at the VMAX, same attack cost, but the first attack in this case is 60 and goes through any effects on your opponent's active. And that second attack does 130 and put 5 damage counters on your opponent's bench Pokemon any way that you like. So I think it's kind of cool. Both the Stage 2 Dragapult and the VMAX are actually kind of similar. The fact that you have 320 HP is great. The fact that you're effectively a Stage 1 is definitely better than the Stage 2 as well. And Psychic just has so many different tools to kind of double down on this type of strategy. We have Spell Tag, of course. We have things like Giratina and the Psychic Baby Blacephalon. We have the new Horror Psychic Energy that's coming out in this same set. So there's definitely a lot of ways to spread your damage counters with this thing. The thing I don't like about it, though, is the fact that the base damage for the second attack here isn't that great. 130 is actually 10 damage shy of 2-shotting all of the tag teams in format. So the fact that you're a VMAX and you might not even be able to 2-shot tag teams until your modifiers come into play is something that I do think is a little bit of a bummer. But being able to choose exactly where your damage counters goes is very efficient. A lot of times doing a smaller amount of damage but having say over where exactly all of that damage goes is more impactful than just hitting something for 300 damage, as an example.
There are different versions of this that are playing either like Greens and Miss Magius, or another one's playing Malamar, and I definitely like the Malamar one more because you can play Hyper Potion as well, which looks really good with the 1 retreat cost. And then also conveniently, we still have Baby Blacephalon, so if they knock out a Dragapult VMAX, then your Baby Blacephalon's immediately at the right prizes to put 12 damage counters on their board. So I think that the Dragapult VMAX is pretty good. I don't know if it's the de facto new direction of Malamar, but I do think that it's solid, and definitely I think would beat the normal Malamar mirror. You one-shot their Giratina, and then you can heal the damage off yourself. So I think there's some strength there. I think it's pretty good.
One of the things we do have to point out is, especially if we ever enter in a format or into a metagame where one prizers become much more viable, Dragapult VMAX becomes an insane card because the secondary effect from this is very, very strong against single prize decks with low HP evolving basics. Being able to pick off some of those pre-evolutions before they get up and running is super, super good. So definitely good against the single prize decks. And like you said, I don't know if this is the way to play Malamar going forward, but it's another variant we can add to the mix. I think there's a lot to like about this card. I definitely want to experiment with it. I think this one's good. Next up, guys, we have ourselves Galarian Sirfetch'd. So this is a new fighting Pokemon, stage 1, 130 HP, psychic weakness to retreat. And its first attack here for a fighting energy does 40, and its second attack for fighting and 2 colors does 180. And this Pokemon can't use this attack as long as it is the active Pokemon. So this is, I think, a card I looked at initially, it was like, man, this is god awful. But the more I've kind of thought about it, the more I've grown to like it a bit more. So the big downside to this card is its attack costs 3 energy to do 180 for a type that traditionally doesn't have very good energy acceleration. Now, I do think there are ways we can get around this though, because of course 2 of the energy and its attack cost are colors, which means we can play twin energy here. So we can, throw down Karate Belt if we go down on prizes, and then attach twin energy, and we can do 180 for effectively just one attachment, which is pretty decent for a type that actually has pretty good damage modifiers. If we are behind on prizes with Martial Arts Dojo, we can one-shot a Gyrosean V. We're fighting, so that means we can also one-shot things like Toxtricity VMAX, Pikarom, etc. So I do think its typing is pretty good in that regard. Of course, we still have Diancie in the mix as well. But in terms of other ways to get around this attack cost, I think the big ones I'm going to be talking about are going to be Zygarde. That would be kind of your ideal way to lead a game with, just to cheat an extra energy attachment into play from discard. I know Xander also probably would put out there, you can play Colossal with this thing. He's been memeing pretty hard with Colossal.
Colossal seems really bad with this. Of all the things that we've talked about, this seems like the worst to play Colossal with.
Oh, I agree. This, if you were even going to play Colossal, I don't think Sirfetch'd should be what you would want to play with it.
Oh, for sure.
But yeah, I think those are some of the existing routes that you could contemplate if you're trying to build around this. While I like this card, my big issue with this, and this goes for a lot of these single prize cards that exist right now, unfortunately, is that I don't see a great way for you to beat ADP variants. That's like the absolute biggest thing with a card like this, is that, yeah, you're going to do great against Pikarom, against Toxtricity, even against a lot of the other upcoming Pokemon V, like Phalanx V, Milotic V, etc., because you can climb up to hit the sort of numbers that you need to take one-shots. But again, with ADP, in the current format at least, just being so utterly dominant, I don't know if you can afford to take a loss to any ADP variant. So that's really where my concerns for this card start to grow.
The problem is that eventually you are going to be ahead on prizes, and so that's where the Zygarde will come in to help that out. But I just hope that it's consistent enough that you can get the energy on board, and then the next turn get the Karate Belt and the twin energy, and then the next turn get another twin energy and something else onto another thing. Like, your steam can run out really fast if you don't have ways to draw into the cards you need. So I hope that the deck can be successful in that, but I'm not sure. I think I'm going to give it a neutral, just because I don't know if the consistency of the deck will work enough in the long game, and then also just ADP is a sketchy matchup.
Like, I mean, we'll have to see. Rebel Clash has a lot of new powerful cards, and of course that will definitely change up the metagame from what it is prior to its release. So, I mean, right now we're kind of in a metagame completely saturated with ADP. And if that continues to be this case, this card just will never see play, basically. I'm actually going to downvote this card, even though I think you can successfully build around it. And I think depending on what your local metagame is like, if your local metagame is heavily dominated by things like Pikarom and Toxtricity VMAX, I think this actually could be a great local call to maybe win a League Challenge or a League Cup. But I don't think there's any chance you do well at a major event with a card like this, given how the current metagame looks to continue on into Rebel Clash.
I think you've sold me into a downvote too. I feel like there's a lot of moving parts that, kind of like how we complain about, like, is this going to be better than Malamar as the best one prize deck? And the answer is just no.
Next up, guys, we have another Stage 2 Pokemon that is going to be Colossal. So Colossal is a fighting type with 160 HP, grass weakness, and 4 retreat cost. And it has this ability here: once during your turn, you may search your discard pile for up to 1 fire and 1 fighting energy and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like. And then its only attack is a fighting 3 colorless for just a flat 130. Not very great. But the ability, of course, is the big thing that we're going to be looking at here. I know Xander has been like memeing about Colossal a little bit throughout this set review, so I'm gonna pass over to him.
I mean, I don't even really know what much of the meme is. Just that it's just good energy acceleration. Like, if you remember Vikavolt Bulu, this is just going to be the Vikavolt and whatever the equation is for that popular deck, if that comes back in any form. I think that the current obvious pair is Sandaconda V, which has, we'll talk about it soon, but the attack is Fighting, colorless, 220, discard 2 energy attached to it. So they just always go back to your discard pile, and you Colossal, put them back on your active, kind of do the same thing, and you're knocking out Zacians and stuff while you do that. So I do think it's solid. But with that being said, though, it's just a generically powerful energy accelerator. From the discard pile is a little bit worse than from the deck, because even though you don't have to play bad cards like Energy Recycler, like the Bulu deck had to, the best part about it was that you needed nothing else other than a Rare Candy and a Vikavolt on turn 2 of the game, and you already got the energy that you need. But in a standard where we have both Giant Hearth and Viridian Forest to search for energies, and you can discard a card in the process, and then we have Professor's Research to discard your hand, draw 7, you're going to be able to get enough energies into the discard pile to make this card work. So I think it's an easy thumbs up, even without a super obvious partner, just because cards like this have been very powerful before, and I'm sure that it'll be powerful at some point while it's legal, just powering up some big dorky VMAX Pokemon that doesn't have great energy acceleration on its own, and then it's just blowing stuff up now that it has Colossal.
So I'm actually not quite as enthusiastic about this thing. Now, granted, getting 2 different types of energies, like you said, with the case of Vikavolt, was definitely very, very good in the past. But I do think it is a somewhat big difference being able to accelerate from deck and accelerate from discard. It's definitely a little bit clunkier. Kind of for the same reason you saw Tapu Lele GX see play as up to a 4 of, whereas Eldegoss V is probably going to see play as no more than a 2 of for most decks. It's just because it's not quite as consistent. And I think that holds true for this card. But nevertheless, fighting has historically been a type that has never really had the best energy acceleration. So anything that does help the type is definitely going to be very much so welcome. You know, we do have Sandaconda V, as Xander pointed out. We also have Marshadow Machamp GX still in format. We have the Lycanroc GX from Team Up still in format. There's even other weird things like the Steelix that can discard Pokemon with 4 retreat that attacks for 2 energy. So you can maybe play this as a form of like perpetual energy acceleration, because you can Pokemaniac basically everything in your deck out, including your energy acceleration. So that's another sort of more cute use for a card like this. Overall, for me, I'm going to stay neutral, just kind of in the middle. Yeah, it's nice that we have acceleration for fighting, but I don't like this as much as something like Vikavolt or even like Rilla Boom that we just got in Sword and Shield. So while it's definitely welcome to the format, I'm not quite as convinced that it might see plays. So I'm going to remain a little bit in the middle here. Next up, guys, we have Sandaconda V, another Pokemon V. It's a basic with 220 HP, Grass Weakness, and 3 retreat costs. 2 different attacks here. First of which is going to be a fighting energy just to do 30 and attach a fighting from discard to this Pokemon. And then second attack for 2 fighting and a colorless is 220, and you discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. So this card's actually eerily familiar. Like it very much so reminds me of Zacian V. They're both these 220 HP basic Pokemon V. They both hit for 220 for 3 energy. This lacks the insane ability of Zacian and has a slightly different downside to its main attack, but nevertheless, these cards do kind of remind me of each other. And that kind of influences my rating for this card as well, because if you're already going to build around a basic attacker that attacks for 3 energy, it would make more sense to build around the one that has an insane suite of support like Metal Saucer, Metal Frying Pan, Arceus Dragapult GX, Lucario Melmetal if you want to go that route as well. So I think for these types of cards, you know, Zacian just has more support. Like, what are your options for Sandaconda? Colossal? Like, sorry, Xander. Like, I'm not playing Colossal and Sandaconda.
I'm not offended.
I'm not playing that over Metal Saucer and Zacian. So that's where I lose a lot of enthusiasm for this card. I mean, we still have Diancie. Don't get me wrong, guys. We still have Martial Arts Dojo to boost the damage output of this thing even more. We have Karate Belt. There's even things like the Baby Zygarde, or even just use the first attack on this to get set up. So there's definitely good things about this, but again, if you're going to build around one of these basic attackers that hits for 220 for 3 energy, there's just a clear one that has more ways to do that and more efficient ways of doing that than the other.
I think it's a little bit better than you're giving it credit for. Not by much. I'll still probably downvote it, but being able to use Diancie and Martial Arts Dojo to one-shot an ADP feels pretty good. But I mean, like it is solid. Like you can do a little bit of chip with the first attack, and then definitely knock out a lot of the. I think you knock out all of the two prize V Pokemon with the second attack, so that's pretty good. But if the metagame moves to VMAXs, you're committing a lot of stuff to take these two shots, and I don't know if you're going to be getting all the energy on it consistently without playing Colossal, and then you're trying to play a stage 2 with this as well. So in the end, it just boils down to I'm not really sure how I feel about Sandaconda.
Yeah, I think the one really good thing about it is the fact that the damage does scale to knock out basically all of the tag teams outside of course, something like Magikarp Wailord. Just because with a Diancie and Martial Arts Dojo, when you're behind on prizes, that will allow you to hit 280, like you mentioned, Xander. So I think that's good. That's definitely one of the best things about this. It hits two very good cards for weakness as well. But with Zacian just having such a much more efficient engine, I just think it will outclass this as an option. All right, guys, next up we have a combo of different cards we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about Phalanx and Phalanx V. So let's go over the Phalanx first. It's a basic with 90 HP and has two different attacks, the first of which is Call for Family. You, just for a colorless energy, you search your deck for up to two basic Pokemon, put them on your bench, then shuffle your deck. And that second attack for two colorless energy, this attack does 30 damage for each Pokemon on your bench with Phalanx in its name. And then looking over at the Phalanx V, 160 HP, second weakness to retreat cost, has this ability, as long as this Pokemon is in play, damage done to any of your Pokemon with Phalanx in its name by your opponent's attacks is reduced by 20. And then its only attack for 2 fighting and a colorless is 210, and this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. You guys can see the clear synergy between both of these. You obviously just want to swarm all these different Phalanx into play. So let's just run through the math really quick on the ability on Phalanx V. If you have 4 of these in play, you're reducing damage done to all of your Phalanx by 80. So you're effectively giving your Vs 240 HP, but then you're also giving the one prize Phalanx 170 HP. So the ability on Phalanx V, definitely really solid. But I think in terms of attacking, the regular Phalanx seems a little bit better overall because you can attack with it just for a single twin energy to power this thing up. So if you have 5 different Phalanx cards on your bench, because this applies to the V or the regular Phalanx, that's going to be 150 damage, and that's not factoring in anything else like Martial Arts Dojo. I think the big reservation I have for this deck is the heavy attack cost on Phalanx V. Much like with the case with all fighting Pokemon, they traditionally have not had the best forms of energy acceleration, but we do have some things. We do have Counter Gain, Karate Belt, Bead, etc. So there are some ways to actually get the V powered up, but I think the base form Phalanx is going to be probably the more efficient attacker that you have with this sort of deck idea.
I think that this is just in a very similar mental space for me as Passimian, where the Passimian deck was just trying to get a bunch of Passimians on the board, but the damage output of the Passimian deck in its later versions with the second Passimian printed was actually higher than this card can go right now, which I think leads me to not be as excited about it as I want to be. Like, I love the Passimian deck. It was super fun. One of the coolest decks that has been out in a while. But I don't think that this really gets there without playing Phalanx V as a possible attacker. And Phalanx V is a clunky attacker if you're trying to also play this Passimian deck. The lists that are being played in Japan play, like, Bede and Counter Gain and Karate Belt. And while all that stuff, like, is okay, it's not necessarily what I would call consistent or great by any means. I think I'm just going to end up giving this a neutral because you do have good damage potential. You knock out Vs pretty well with Phalanx V, and you're kind of hard to knock out. Like, you force the ADP deck to have to use Altered Creation as soon as they can, because if you have all of your Phalanx Vs in play, Zacian can't one-shot Phalanx V. It's solid. It's just a question of, since the Phalanx attacker, the baby Phalanx version of the deck, I don't think is good enough on its own. You're forced to have to play stuff for the Phalanx V, and then is it consistent enough? And that I just don't know.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be the big thing. That's a kind of a question mark right now. And I'm actually in the same boat. I'm going to give this kind of a neutral rating. I actually really love this combo of cards, but the clunky attack costs of the V are going to be the big thing that might potentially hold this back. But at the same time, I'll kind of play devil's advocate with myself by saying, you know, this deck really doesn't need too much to get going. You just need your Phalanx and some energy. So maybe you can afford to take a turn off to play a supporter like Bead. At the very least, you can count on us covering it here on the channel at some point. But for right now, I'm kind of in the middle with Xander. I think it has potential, but there are some question marks as to how consistent its setup can be with some of these clunky attack costs. Next up, guys, we have Galarian Weezing, another Stage 1 Pokemon. This one's going to be 130 HP, Fighting Weakness, 3 Retreat. It has this ability, as long as this Pokemon is your active, each of your opponent's Pokemon has no abilities. And then it's only attack for 1 Dark Energy, Severe Poison. Your opponent's active is now Poison. Put 4 damage counters for Poison between turns. So one thing I think is really weird is the fact that so many people in the community were just hyping this card so much when it got revealed, and we're saying how broken it was and all of this stuff because we have a form of ability lock coming back. But honestly, guys, I don't think this card is very good at all. This is not nearly as good as something like Garbodor or even Wobbuffet from Phantom Forces for that matter. And the big reason for that is this has to be your active, which means this either needs to be some sort of wall Pokemon in like a hit and run style deck, or this has to be a main attacker in a deck. But the thing is, it doesn't do a good job at either of those. It has a 3 retreat cost, which means it can't abuse Air Balloon. So your hit and run style deck with something like Beheeyem, Hitmonchan, Morpeko, V, etc. isn't really very great. And then its attack itself is only doing 4 damage counters at a time, and in a format that plays so many decks with maxed out counts of Switch and some copies of Mallow and Lana in some cases, I don't think this status condition is going to actually stay long enough for you to really rack up a good amount of damage. So as a result, I think Weezing just kind of gets put into an awkward spot here where it doesn't really have a home. I think if I was going to attempt to build around this, we do have things like Toxicroak to increase the poison damage that your opponent is going to be taking. There's things like Dust Island as well that are still in the format. You can maybe try to play Spirit Tomb in here and just basically wall with Weezing while you build up these Spirit Tombs with lots of damage counters on them. That's about where I start to run out of ideas for the moment. If we had a Floatstone reprint, then suddenly Galarian Weezing, I think, gets substantially better.
I think that the only way this would really work is if you were just playing complete disruption on side of it, like if you're playing Crushing Hammers and Team Yell Grunts and stuff like that, because they can get an attacker and take a few prizes before poison really gets to them. And even a lot of the decks that we say are ability based, once they get one attacker going, they don't need their abilities anymore. Like ADP, they still can use Zacian for 1 turn before you evolve into Galarian Weezing. They can just Ultimate Ray and knock you out. The Mewtwo decks play enough random basics they can attack with that they can hopefully get through this. So I just don't think that there's a lot there for this card in the long run, especially as more VMAXs come out, which they don't seem to be really having abilities. They're just not going to really care about your dorky Weezing that does 4 damage of poison every single turn. So I have to vote this card down. I don't see where the hype is coming from.
Again, now I will say, if we do get a Floatstone reprint, down the road, this card I think does skyrocket in playability because now it's at least viable as a hit and run sort of target. But for the moment, I'm right there with you. I don't think this card is very good. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Spirit Tomb. Spirit Tomb is a basic Pokemon with 60 HP, Grass Weakness, 2 retreat cost. First attack here for a Dark Energy, discard the top card of each player's deck, and its second attack for a Dark and Colorless, put damage counters on your opponent's active equal to the number of Pokemon in your discard pile. So I know we already looked at Hatterene in this same set review, but Spirit Dream's kind of like a basic form of that. Obviously there's some pretty big differences between them. Spirit Tomb is a basic, which is fantastic compared to Hatterene, which is a stage 2, but on the flip side, you don't have access to things like Spell Tag, the Horror, Psychic Energy. You have a 2 attack cost, so there definitely are trade-offs for the very nice perk of being a basic. But I feel like I'm kind of in the same boat on this card as I am the Hatterene. I'm really not a big fan of the fact that you're replacing damage counters and not doing actual damage. Just because I think right now in the current state of the game, I think HPs are just like far too high for an attack like this to really be effective. And the fact that it takes an additional energy is also somewhat of an inconvenience to play around as well. And I actually will point out there is another Spirit Tomb in format that will allow you to discard Pokemon from your deck. So there is some synergy between that one and this one. But overall, I think I might even like a Hatterene more.
If we had like Dark Patch and Standard, I think that this would definitely be better, but certainly without anything like that, I think that the 1 energy cost on Hatterene definitely makes that a better addition if you're trying to build a deck like this. We do have counter gain, but that requires being behind, which you probably will be because this doesn't seem good. But I don't think that's enough to rely on overall to get this deck working. So I'm going to downvote it.
Yeah, and I will point out a couple things if you guys are intent on attempting to build around this. Like Xander said, we do have counter game, but we also have the Coco Prism Star sort of engine, so you can play maybe 3 or 4 lightning energies in here as well. plus your Cocoa Prism to like cheat an extra energy or two into play, like in the mid game once your Spirit Tomb goes down. So we have that. We do have Bead in the format right now too. So there are some ways to cheat extra energy, but I'm not sure if they are efficient enough to really just be a winning strategy. So I'm right there with you. I'm gonna have to downvote Spirit Tomb. Alrighty, up next, guys, we have ourselves a new Garbodor. This is going to be 120 HP, Stage 1, Fighting Weakness, and 2 Retreat Cost. And so this has an ability, once during your turn, if there is a stadium in play, you may leave your opponent's active poisoned, and its only attack here is just Dark, 2 colorless, 80 damage. So it's funny, whenever the scans were leaking from this set overnight originally, and people saw there was a new Garbodor with a bad attack, but an ability, people were scrambling to see, you know, do we have Garbotoxin back? And unfortunately, we don't have a card that is nearly as good as the previous ability-based Garbodors, but I do think there are some practical applications for this, or I guess really just one, in standard format, and that, of course, is going to be with the new Toxtricity VMAX that we already kind of discussed with this. So the idea, of course, is you can use this ability, poison them, and then your Toxtricity V and VMAX can hit for large amounts of damage. You know, myself and Xander, we actually did comb through the card pool pretty thoroughly, and there's really not too much else that could really be paired with this. I think one of the only other options, there's like a random Xatu that's in format that on a coin flip can put your opponent's HP down to 10. That's about the only other thing we could really find. I think outside of Toxtricity VMAX, there's really not any great applications for this. It's not really a good damage modifier, just because we already have Flapple. And with Flapple, you can at least get it out of play after you've used its ability. We have other things like Shrine, Vitality Band, so I don't think Garbodor is your best damage modifier. I think this is basically exclusively good for the Toxtricity VMAX deck that we have here.
Yeah, unless we get some kind of good attacker that will do damage and then maybe increase poison damage on them. Like, we haven't really seen anything that doesn't poison but then increases the poison damage while also doing damage. There's like a random Dragalge that it's like if they're poisoned, it does 10 damage of poison in between turns instead of 1. I think this card is not necessarily anything special on its own.
Yeah, I'm going to actually give it a good rating only because it's only, I think, right now as good as the Toxtricity deck. And I do think Toxtricity VMAX is pretty solid, so I'm going to stand beside it, but just know that there's no other great application for this at the moment outside of Toxtricity VMAX, of course. Next up, guys, we have another Pokemon VMAX, and that is going to be Malamar VMAX. So let's take a look at Malamar V first and foremost. So it is a basic 210 HP, Grass Weakness to Retreat Cost, and its first attack for a Dark and Colorless. You switch your opponent to active with one of their bench Pokemon, and it does 30 to the new active Pokemon. And its second attack for 2 Dark and Colorless is 130. Your opponent's active is now Confused. So nothing very special there, but Malamar VMAX is a little bit more interesting. It's a VMAX with 310 HP, Grass Weakness to Retreat Cost, and its only attack here is 2 Dark and a Colorless, does 180. Your opponent reveals their hand, you choose one card that you find there and put it on the bottom of your opponent's deck. 180, though it doesn't seem like a lot, is actually a good number to basically two-shot everything in the game right now. And there's actually a lot of hand disruption that we have in format. Of course, we have Marnie, that's one of the more recent cards that really pairs nicely with this. You can put your opponent down at a 4-card hand, use this attack to put them at a 3-card hand and only leave them with the exact 3 cards that you want them to have. There's things like Chip Ice Axe, which Xander pointed out to me, so you can control your opponent's hand, and then there's top deck from there if you really want to lock down their hand a little bit more. But really the big issue with this card is the attack cost. Dark, unfortunately, is just not a great type right now for energy acceleration. I think probably the best way to get this thing powered up is going to be with the Weavile GX Red and Blue combo, at least until the new Hydreigon comes out. But of course, with Weavile GX, you can use Red and Blue to evolve into it, get 2 energies in play, and use your Weavile GX to move those energies off of Weavile onto your Malamar VMAX. Kind of like a Dark Box deck, but less boxy and more just geared around Malamar VMAX. I think that's probably like the main way I would envision building around this card.
Yeah, and I think that this attack is actually really good. It's just a matter of getting it powered up. You're going to be two-shotting stuff, which is fine, but very similar to Trevnor and Expanded, it doesn't matter how long it takes for you to win the game if your opponent can't do anything. So I think that this is actually really interesting, especially with the Chip Ice Axe idea that I had. I think that gives it a lot more potential because you're putting the best card in their hand on the bottom, and then it's not shuffling their deck, and then they're going to draw whatever bad card you put on top. I do think that trying to get this powered up is going to be the most difficult part of it, and you might just get ran over by decks that are able to put energy on the table before you start locking them out of the game. But if you can knock out their attacker and then take away a supporter in their hand, then you probably won the game from there. So I'm going to end up giving this card a neutral, but I think it's really neat. I like it a lot.
I'm actually going to downvote this one. While I like this attack, and I do think there are a lot of cards that synergize well with it, of course, getting it powered up is the huge obstacle it has. And the other thing I think that really takes me from a more neutral rating to a negative rating is the fact that you can't even one-shot regular Pokemon V like Zacian and other 200-ish HP Pokemon. I really wish this damage was closer to 210 or 220 or a way to easily scale it up to that amount. So 180 watt two-shots everything. There's a lot of stuff I don't really want to be two-shotting at the same time. I don't mind two-shotting VMAXs but in tag teams, but I don't want to be two-shotting regular two-prize Pokemon V. So those are the two big things that are really holding this card back for me. So I'm going to have to give this one the thumbs down. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a Grimmsnarl card. So Grimmsnarl is going to be a Stage 2 Pokemon with 170 HP here. It has Grass Weakness and 3 Retreat Cost. And it has this ability, as long as this Pokemon is your opponent's active pays 1 more energy to use its attacks. And then for its attack here, for a dark and 2 colorless, does 100 plus 30 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. You know, think of something like an ADP. Just as an example, they're reliant on manual attachments to get off Altered Creation GX on turn 2, and if you're able to get a turn 2 Grimmsnarl on the active, that might potentially even set them behind another turn, which can, be pretty impactful a lot of the time. And this attack, I don't think, is that bad either. So if your average attacker in the game takes 3 energy to attack, and they have a 4th on them, you're going to be doing 220 with this, assuming they have 4 energy only on their Pokemon. So that's really not a bad amount of damage. You're able to one-shot a Zacian V, and pretty much most of the non-tag team, non-VMAX Pokemon that are running around in the game. But I can already see what Xander is going to say is how you get this thing powered up. I know that's where he's going to kind of roast this card.
The main problem that I have with this is that while the ability and the attack play well together, the way that you're getting 2 energy on this is most likely through manual attachments. I don't think that you're playing Bead in this deck, or I don't think that you're playing Red and Blue Weavile combo like we talked about for Malamar. I don't think we're playing any of that stuff just because you're trying to fit a stage 2. But since you're powering it up with manual attachments, I kind of want to move to like hammers and stuff, because once you get your first Grimmsnarl out, you can play hammers, you disrupt their energy, but then your attack does less damage. So there's a really fine middle ground between, oh, well, I need to two-shot them, but also I need them to not be able to attack me to knock me out because I'm not going to have the ability to invest more resources into another attacker. So if they knock out your first Grimmsnarl that has 2 different energy on it, you can't even counter gain this so that you can attack with it again on your next turn to retaliate against whatever they're doing. So I think overall, I'm just not certain about how this card is going to end up winning the game in the long run, because even though the ability and the attack synergize well, since you're still playing a slow stage 2 deck that's trying to manually attach every single turn, I don't know if you're going to... I don't think that the ability is enough to keep up with the rest of the metagame.
I mean, that's going to be the big thing, the fact that you need 2 manual attachments on a stage 2 Pokemon. That's... I mean, that's the big drawback here. You're already somewhat inconsistent just naturally being a stage 2 and then needing 2 attachments when there's actually a lot of other decent sort of stage 2s that can get powered up in one turn. It's kind of a hard sell sometimes. However, I'm actually still going to remain a little bit neutral on this card. I really do like this ability here on this thing. Of course, we do have Crushing Hammer still in the format, like Xander mentioned as well, to maybe slow down your opponent. And now with Twin Energy coming out in this set, I mean, I do think you can get this thing powered up, but again, it definitely has some pretty big drawbacks to it, but I like this card enough to kind of remain a little bit neutral on it at the end of the day. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Probopass. Probopass is a stage 1 Pokemon with 140 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 4 Retreat Cost. And it has this attack for a Metal Energy, does 10, plus 30 more for each energy in your opponent's active's Retreat Cost. And then its second attack for 2 Metal and Colorless does 120. So we already looked at the Milotic V from the set that already does something kind of similar to this. And actually, this first attack here is actually the same attack that we already have on the Tangrowth that came out back in Cosmic Eclipse. So this is basically just the same thing, but we have to think, well, is there any incentive to play this Probopass over Tangrowth? Because I think the Tangrowth is actually a pretty decent card. We posted about it here on the channel that card was really, really solid. And the big upside that Probopass has over Tangrowth is the fact that you have some different forms of metal support out there. Like you have Metal Frying Pan, you have Buff Padding, you have Metal Saucer if you really want to play that. But I feel like the upsides to both Milotic and Tangrowth probably outshine any of the pros to Probopass. So of course with Milotic, the big thing, it's a basic and it hits harder than Probopass. But with Tangrowth, I think the two big things that really are the absolute selling points for Tangrowth over Probopass is the fact that we have Netball, and more importantly, you have two very good Tangulas to actually use. So there is the Poison Tangela that inflicts double poison damage, and then more importantly, there's the Tangle Drag Tangela that allows you to switch your opponent's active with one of their bench Pokemon. When I played the Tangrowth deck, I literally won probably a quarter, maybe to a third of my games because of Tangle Drag. And the fact that Probopass doesn't have any of these sort of very good pre-evolutions, I think is the big thing that makes me not really want to play this.
I am going to abstain only because I have played none of the Tangrowth deck, and so I don't really have an opinion. You are definitely had knowledge of that. So if you say so, then frankly I will agree.
I'm the authority figure on bad meme decks.
Feel free to send all of the controlling cards my way. I will send anything with evolution Pokemon to you.
It's not really bad. There's just two other cards that do the same thing, but are slightly better. So as a result, Probopass won't be good unless we actually see maybe some sort of Metal Weak Pokemon pop up at some point that's very prevalent in the metagame. That could be one of the only situations I see this outshining those. But for the moment, not really too much incentive to play this over the other cards of its kind. Alrighty guys, next up we actually have our very last Pokemon VMAX of the set review, and that is going to be Copperajah V and VMAX. So of course, before we get to the VMAX, let's take a look at its base form. Copperajah V, 220 HP, Fire Weakness, 4 Retreat Cost, and has 2 different attacks, the first of which is 2 Metal and a Colorless, does 90, and during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon takes 30 less damage from attacks. And its second attack for 3 Metal and a Colorless does a flat 180. And Copperajah VMAX, 340 HP, so right up there with Snorlax VMAX as having, the most HP in the game right now. And a lot of the same stats here. It has the Fire, Weakness, Grass Resistance for Retreat, and its attacks cost the same amount as its pre-evolution as well. But the first one here does 100 plus 100 more if your opponent's active is a basic. And then its second attack for 3 Metal and a Colorless does a flat 240. So Xander, I remember you being a bit enthusiastic about this card. I'll pass this one over to you.
Yeah, I think this card is pretty sweet. I like it a lot in the ADP Zacian deck as a tech for the mirror. I know that deck has a lot of stuff going on, but after you Altered Creation, the first attack on Copperajah VMAX knocks out a Zacian, and you'll take 3 prizes, and then you can't really get one shot in return because you have 340 HP. That's just not a number that those decks are used to hitting. So I think that that's pretty good. And then even outside of Zacian, this attack after an Altered Creation knocks out all of the regular V Pokemon and will take 3 prizes on them, so I think that's pretty good. And then, second attack on Copperajah VMAX, the 3 Metal Colorless 240, after an Altered Creation will knock out all of the tag teams except Arceus Palkia. So the math checks out pretty well. In terms of their own deck, I don't think that Metal Saucer and Zacian on its own is good enough. I think that you want to play this in the ADP deck just because you only have a limited supply of Metal Saucers you can use. And so I think that once your kind of first big attacker gets knocked out, you're going to struggle. But maybe I'm wrong, and maybe that the regular deck for this could work just because since you have so much HP, you could play like Mixed Herbs or some of the other random cards that are in Standard. I think that out of all the things that there could be a Greens variant of, this definitely seems like one of them that could, though if you play Greens, you're not playing Zacian. Who knows? I think this card's interesting. Definitely one of the ones that I'm looking forward to testing more than some of the other stuff.
I think you can build around this kind of in the same way you build around Zacian Array. Like, of course, you can go the highly aggressive ADP route, but also I think you can go a more defensive route just because, like you said, you have 340 HP. This is the most HP we have in the game right now. And Metal has a lot of tanking options, even outside of having 340 HP. So we have Metal Frying Pan, of course, to get rid of Fire Weakness, which bumps you up to effectively 370. From there, we also have Lucario and Melmetal GX. If you want to go that route, you can burn Full Metal Wall GX and have effectively 400 HP if you factor in Frying Pan in addition to that. So, I mean, I think there's an argument to be made to go that route as well. But I think this card is super, super strong. It's both insanely defensive and also has some of the best offensive options for this type right now, too. So, Comprised VMAX, if this is the last VMAX of the set review, I think we picked a pretty good note to end on. So, yeah, definitely a big fan of this card. Alrighty guys, next up we have a Duraludon card. This is a basic with 130 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 2 retreat cost. And it has 2 different attacks, the first of which is just for a colorless energy, does 30, and you attach a metal from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. And that other attack is just 2 metal and a colorless for a flat 110. So this card definitely will, conjure memories of the Registeel we had from Crimson Invasion, which was a card that saw some degree of play. This isn't really much better or worse than that card. It's kind of nice that it costs a colorless, which does make it flexible if you do want to play it in like your Zacian ADP deck or something like that for some reason. But this card isn't too groundbreaking to me. I do somewhat like this card. I think this actually kind of makes sense in the like Copperajah green sort of deck you talked about during Copperajah Xander. I could definitely see this as kind of being like your lead, similar to like Baby Volk and stuff like that, like we've seen in Green Zard. So that seems like probably the best home I can think of. I don't think you're going to play this in any of your Zacian decks as it is, just because Intrepid Sword is already so good, and you have Metal Saucer, so I don't know if there's too much of a need for this right now, but it's just like another overall pretty solid inclusion in your toolbox of metal options that we have at this point.
I mean, the good thing about all these cards is that they kind of can enable colorless style attackers to play specific energy just to get extra acceleration on the board. I can't really think of any of those that are crazy relevant off the top of my head, but I do like having random stuff like this in standard just because it does give you some choices whenever you're deck building for decks that don't just have like automatic acceleration. But I think that this Duraludon's worth considering, and it does make me think a little bit more about the Greens Copperajah deck. I think that's pretty cool. I'm gonna give this card probably just a neutral, just like it's a good card, but it's certainly not the most exciting card in the set.
I'm gonna remain neutral on this one. It has some promise here. I think this card really only matters if the 30 damage is suddenly very, very relevant from this. Like, you're not playing this for the energy acceleration just because metal already is doing a pretty good job of that. It's a combination of getting some acceleration plus setting up your math in a way that allows you to take a knockout against something that's very prevalent. And with Zacian decks already doing a pretty good job at one-shotting, I'm just skeptical if this is going to make its way into any of the Zacian decks. But definitely one to just kind of keep in your back pocket. Like I said, it's just another solid tool we have in our toolbox of metal options right now. So I'm going to stay neutral on it, but not a groundbreaking card by any means. Next up, guys, we have a new Chatot card that's coming out in this set, and Chatot is a basic Pokemon with 70 HP, Lightning Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and 1 Retreat. And it has this ability here: once during your turn, whenever you play this card from your hand onto your bench, you may flip a coin. If heads, choose a supporter card from your discard pile, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Then just has a vanilla 30 for 2 energy. But of course, the ability is the kind of the star of the show here. And I think this card is actually really, really cool because one thing we always get in the comments of videos is, when we have Jirachis or Dedennes in our list, and of course going back into the past with things like Shaman and Tapu Lele, we always get comments saying, you know what, like, I play casually, or, my budget's tight, I really can't afford to drop money on, like, I can't afford to drop $100 on a playset of some of these important staple cards. What can I replace these with in my deck? And Chatot's actually pretty cool because it gives us a direct sort of option like that for maybe people who are on a budget and might not be able to get their hands on a playset of the new Eldegoss V, which no doubt is going to be one of the big chase cards from the set. So I think this is actually just really cool from that standpoint, but I think there's actually a consideration to playing this over Eldegoss in certain decks. Well, I think 90% of decks will probably just play Eldegoss. If you are a one prize deck that has a heavy scoop up net engine already, I think I would probably play Chatot over Eldegoss in that sort of deck, because even if you flip tails, you can just pick it up and try again at some point in the game. And also, of course, it gives up only 1 prize, which is one of the big advantages it has over Eldegoss. So I think I actually would maybe consider playing this in that sort of situation. But Xander, I don't know. Do you think I'm just reaching a little bit there, or should we just play? Should we just still just play Eldegoss over this?
I think what you said's right. Like, if you're playing Scoop of Net and you don't want to put two prize Pokemon down on your board, then Chatot definitely looks a lot better for whatever certain decks are doing. And yeah, it is kind of a big whiff if you bench the Chatot and then you don't get a supporter and then you have to play a Scoop of Net to try to get a supporter from your discard pile. But I don't think that it's bad enough for the decks that are playing Scoop of Net that it's not worth considering. Or maybe even you play like one Chatot, one Eldegoss instead of two Eldegoss. I think that's a suggestion for in a time where it's like if you have a Scoop of Net in your hand, you can quick ball for Chatot, but if you don't have a Scoop of Net in your hand, you can quick ball for Eldegoss and then be just fine. But I do like this card. If you are getting into the game, you're starting at League, you don't want to put a whole paycheck into getting cards for the game, or you're going to accumulate cards up slowly, I think that this is a really cool card that I'd probably pick up one or two anyway, even if you are a competitive player. But even if you're, like, you would say that you mostly just play at League, this is a great card to throw into a few of your decks to get some extra consistency.
As far as where I stand on this, I think I'm going to remain a little bit neutral just because I do think there are applications where Scoop Up Net can be good with this since they won't work on Eldegoss. So I think that does give this card a shred of competitive potential instead of just saying it's like outright bad since we have Eldegoss coming out in the same set.
If Eldegoss came out in the next set and we didn't know that that card was existing, Eric and I would be flipping out over this card. It's just that we have a better version right now, but I don't think that makes Chatot any worse. It's still a powerful card, it just has a better replacement.
Next up, guys, we have the very last Pokemon of the set review and also our last Pokemon V, and that's going to be Dubwool V. So this is going to be a basic Pokemon, 210 HP, fighting weakness, and a 2 retreat. It has this ability, damage done to this Pokemon by attacks is reduced by 30, and its only attack here for 3 colorless energy does 120, plus 30 more for each prize card your opponent has taken. You know, we've seen attacks like this be successful in the past. I think one of the more notable ones that immediately comes to mind for me is the Shaman EX back from Next Destiny. Saw a lot of play, being able to just throw it down and nuke any Pokemon EX at the time was pretty strong. I really like this because there's a bunch of ways to easily power it up with Malamar, Welder, etc. Throw this down when your opponent only has one prize left, and you can hit for 270 and basically say, hey, I can just kind of like take a knock on anything you have. Can you do 240 to take your last prize? Or do you have like a boss's orders or something like that? But I think this card is overall very splashable. I think it'll pop up in a number of different decks.
Having this colorless attack cost does make it very splashable, but there's not a lot of energy switch style decks running around that would be able to move the energy onto here in another way. Both the Welder decks, especially Ability Zard from what I was thinking, and Malamar can really easily force the opponent to get to exactly one prize left. And especially in Malamar, Spell Tag will make it so that if you have to knock out a tag team or a VMAX Pokemon, you can probably get there by doing 270. But having effectively a 240 HP basic that does minimum 120 and then scales up during the game is really good. And I think this card is a card that people have not been talking about enough. Definitely one of the better inclusions for this set.
This is definitely a card you'll probably only see as a one of, but nevertheless, I think you will definitely see it, though, just because of how strong I think this card can be. I think definitely a very positive note to conclude all of the Pokemon we're talking about in this set review. Solid card. Next up, we have the new supporter card, Boss's Orders. So Boss's Orders is going to look very familiar to anyone who's been playing for a while. It says choose one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and switch it with their active Pokemon. So this is literally just a reprint of Lysander under a different name, and this card is definitely actually going to be one of the most impactful cards in the set, easily, no questions asked. Like, I know we have a ton of gusting methods already, like we have Custom Catcher, Pokemon Catcher, Great Catcher, even things like Ninetales and the new Appleton, but the vast majority of the time, most decks are playing 2 to 3 copies of this in their deck going forward, and are going to forego all of these other options. I think maybe the only one of the previous options that might still see play is maybe Ninetales, or maybe like a single copy of Great Catcher in some lists. But most of the time, I think decks are just going to be playing probably 3 Boss's Orders and calling it a day. This effect, as long as the game has existed, has always been one of the absolute best effects. And I don't think the current state of the game is any different. This is definitely, I think, going to be one of the best cards in the set overall.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot to say. Lysander was played in every single standard that existed, and I think it's going to be very annoying, but also very good. The one thing I do like about Boss's Orders is that it makes standard a little bit less grindy, where like these really long, like two-shot based matchups, like what I've noticed about the tag team matchups is that both players stay at 6 prizes for a very long time, and then after someone takes a knockout, the game's over in like 3 turns. And I think this is going to make those games go a little bit quicker, because while they're kind of doing that dance of retreating back and forth, you can just play a Boss's Orders and take your prizes and call it a day. But it's also just frustrating because some of the decks that are cool that do rely on more setup are just going to get punished because of Boss's Orders.
You're definitely right about that. Nevertheless, so it's definitely going to be an impactful card and probably an expensive one. It is a holo rare in Japan's Rebellious Clash set, but like we said, definitely easily one of the best cards in the entire set. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Pokemon tool card. This is going to be Burning Scarf. If the fire Pokemon this card is attached to is your active Pokemon and is damaged by an opponent's attack, the attacking Pokemon is now burned. So we did talk about this card already a good bit when discussing the Arcanine towards the beginning of our set review. And of course, it definitely has a home there if you ever were going to play Arcanine. But the question is, does it really make any sense to play this outside of the context of that type of deck? And I'm really not convinced that it is. It would have to be very important for your math to knock out some specific archetypes in the format to be reliant on this. But this card reminds me a lot of Rocky Helmet of the past, which saw, virtually no play at all. And these types of passive tools like this just historically haven't been that good, with Spell Tag being one of the only major exceptions in recent memory. And you do have to remember we have Tool Scrapper coming back into the format as well, so these types of cards aren't going to be as safe as they would have been in previous formats without Tool Scrapper.
I can't think of any decks that have considered playing Rocky Helmet before, and surely this is not helping me get there really right now. I'm not impressed by it, and I think that if all that you need to do is 20 damage, there are better ways to do it, like the Flapple that you were so excited about and other stuff. So I'm overall just not a big supporter of this card.
Yeah, probably Arcanine's going to be the only home it might have in the short term. Not the best trainer card in the set by any means. Next up, we have another Pokemon tool card that is going to be Cursed Shovel. So this is a Pokemon tool. It says, if the Pokemon this tool is attached to is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, discard the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. So Xander, I know you are definitely more of the mill player between the two of us, so I'm going to throw this one over to you. How do you feel about Cursed Shovel?
The mill decks are already very powerful, being able to go like Surge, Bell of a Bryson Man, Bell of a Bryson Man, and now if you are trying to advance your game plan by knocking them out, you have to discard even more cards from the top of your deck. I don't think this card is an automatic 4 of, just because the space is tight. You're trying to play like a very thick Cinccino line and like the Mewtwo Magcargo little package and Pokédolls. But being able to send up a Lily's Pokédoll with a Cursed Shuffle on it and make it so they don't take a prize and they mill 2 cards seems incredibly powerful. Another thing that's good about this is that right now, at the time of filming, all of the control decks are like these like very, let's just aggressively mill you as fast as possible decks. If we get a deck that kind of looks like Pidgeotto used to, where it's more focused on energy denial and stuff like that, Cursed Shovel could be really good because it advances the mill game plan while your Orangers get knocked out, while you're still resource managementing back the cards you need to disrupt their energy. So you can kind of attack them 2 different ways where it hurts. This card's really solid. I'm not going to say it's one of the best cards in the set, because I don't think that control cards ever really make it that high. But if you're trying to play the control deck, this is one of the first cards that I would put into your list from this set.
Yeah, this is one of those cards that makes me happy that Tool Scrapper is getting a reprint. Definitely a good card. Unfortunately, it's getting printed. This isn't the type of deck building I like to encourage from people, but it's definitely a good card for the different control and mill archetypes that exist. Next up, guys, we have a new item card that's going to be Full Bucket. It says, search your deck for 2 water energy, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is basically just a Professor's Letter, but just for water energy, which is fine. We have Frostmoth, which came out back in Sword and Shield, which I think will love a card like this. Frostmoth hasn't really caught on quite in the way that I think a lot of us thought. And this is definitely going to give that archetype a boost, because right now your options are for Frostmoth are basically Viridian Forest, and then some of the supporter-based forms like Fisherman and Lady. And I don't think those options are the most optimal. So the fact we have Full Bucket, which gets you twice as many cards as Viridian and doesn't have the discarding effect, I think is super, super solid.
Yeah, this card is just generically solid. We've seen powerful effects like this before in the form of Professor's Letter, and though this is obviously a strict downgrade from that, I don't think that the water decks are going to care too much because they get to play the exact same card as they did before. Definitely makes Frostmoth look a lot better because the best energy search that they had was Viridian Forest. You have to play the Viridian Forest to discard a card to get 1 water, and now you can just play this to get 2 waters, and you kind of get to skip that middle step. Definitely think Full Bucket's good.
I think you could also make the case to play this in some sort of deck based around Blastoise Piplup GX, as they are trying to accelerate water energy from hand with its attack. But beyond that, guys, not really too much else to say about this card. I think it's solid for the decks that it looked to be used in. Next up, guys, we have a new Stadium card that is going to be Galar Mine. It says the retreat cost of each active Pokemon, both yours and your opponent's, is 2 more energy. So we've seen cards like this in the past. I think some of the more recent cards of this kind are going to be the Mount Lanakila and also the Team Aqua's Secret Base, I believe it's called. Both those cards saw some degree of play, in Galar Mine I think is going to be no exception. It's actually a little less limiting than the previous 2, so actually this might even see more play than both of those. And I know both me and Xander are actually excited for this card for different reasons. I'm obviously stoked about it because I'm a big proponent of the Tangrowth deck, and this definitely gives Tangrowth a big boost. And of course the new Milotic V. In the case of Tangrowth, this basically reads plus 60 damage, and in the case of Milotic V, this reads plus 100.
I'm actually amazed that they printed this card because this card is just so silly. They've printed 1 retreat increasing stuff before, and that's already been really good. Like Absol's a super playable card in Standard, and it increases retreat by 1. And now they printed this Stadium card that's going to increase it by 2 on every Pokemon, not just basics. I'm honestly amazed that they decided to print this card. It's really obnoxious with the control decks. You can constantly just bosses order something to their active, pass. Definitely is going to help out the mill strategy because they're not going to be able to retreat it because it's got 2 extra retreat. I think this card is kind of an abomination. I don't know where they thought that printing this card would be a great idea. Just like even take it outside of any context of mill. They've only ever printed stuff that increases retreat by 1, and now they're going to double that. This card's very good.
It's definitely going to be very annoying to play against. You're going to hate your life whenever your opponent throws this thing down. But nevertheless, that still doesn't take away from how good of a card it is. So big thumbs up for me. Next up, we have another supporter card. This is going to be Milo. It says discard up to 2 cards from your hand, then draw twice as many cards as you discarded. So this is actually just a slight upgrade to the card we had called Sophocles back from, I believe, Burning Shadows it was. Sophocles really didn't see too much play. Some of the Blacephalon decks did play it briefly during the Lost Thunder format as like a 1-of, sometimes I think maybe a 2-of, but that was really about it. Sophocles really never saw large, widespread play, and I don't think Milo is really going to be that much different. The fact that you can discard up to 2 cards is nice, does give you a little bit of flexibility, but think of it this way, discard 1 to draw 2 seems pretty bad when you have something like Hop that can just get you a straight draw 3. So I really wish this was discard up to 2 cards, draw 3 for each you discard. That I would actually be on board for. That would actually make me consider playing this over something like Professor's Research or Cynthia, etc. And the fact that we just got Professor's Research in the last set also makes this kind of a hard sell, since you can just discard your whole hand and draw 7 instead of 4.
Generally speaking, Pokemon is a game of you just want to draw as many cards as you want. It's like you either want to draw as many cards as you want or you want to search for the most specific cards that you can. And so this card definitely is in category 1, and it just gets classed out by Cynthia and Professor's Research and even Marnie, just because Marnie has the disruptive element to it. Like, to play this card, to draw half the amount of cards as you would with a Research, you have to discard 2 cards. And normally whenever you're playing Research, you're at the point that you don't care about what's in your hand, similar to how you wouldn't care discarding cards with Milo. This card is not great, sadly, which is really a big bummer because I really like the Milo character. I think that he's hilarious. Just like, he just looks funny and it makes me smile.
Definitely not a great card. You know, maybe if we didn't get Research printed in the last set, we might have more good things to say about this. But since we have Research and we now have, just in general, a pretty solid pool of supporters again, Milo really, I don't think can hold up to the other ones that we have. Next up, guys, we have a new item card, and that is going to be Nugget. So it says play this card when you draw it from your deck at the start of your turn before putting it into your hand, and then draw 3. So this is kind of like the item equivalent to all of the different stage 1s we looked at, like the Luxio and the Lombre from earlier in the set review. So we have now an item card that functions similarly and gets you, a draw effect here. And just in general, drawing cards as an item compared to a supporter is historically been very, very good. Anytime you can draw cards in a way that isn't with a supporter tends to be very, very powerful. I definitely think there's some pros and cons to this card, but I'm going to pass this over to Xander. I know he had some specific thoughts on this thing.
I think Nugget's really solid and a card that a lot of people really are not considering. The obvious partner is Oranguru, where you can use Oranguru to put this card on top of your deck at the end of your turn, and then draw at the beginning of your turn to draw 3 cards. And I think that is really, really good. I don't think this is the card that you're playing 4 of just because of deck space, but where I really like it is in the mid game, where you need to see more cards as a response to a knockout, so you can kind of draw all the stuff that you need to. And then with Oranguru already being a powerful card that so many decks are playing, I think you can get away with really playing like 2 of these in your deck for the turns that you need it. Because one thing that is pretty cool, it's like if you have the stuff in your hand, or you think your hand is pretty good, you don't need to put the Nugget on top of your deck immediately. You can save it for the next turn because it's still in your hand, it's safe there, and then you can put it on top of your deck. I feel like the natural response is people are going to say, but Xander, you both were not very impressed with the Pokemon that had the ability to put it on the bench, so what makes this card better? And I think the difference is that since those are Pokemon and you're trying to attack with their evolutions, it's a really inconsistent way to get one Pokemon into play kind of a turn, where you need to have as many of your basics in play so you can rare candy them as fast as possible. Whereas with this, if they Judge or Marnie or Reset Stamp you, or even if they like Bellaba and Bryson Man in the mill decks, you're not losing that much value because drawing 1 card to start your turn has always been fine. This is just extra value. The decks that I like it in are obviously just anything that plays Oranguru. I think that the Welder decks can make best use of it because you can draw 3 cards to have more fire energy in your hand, get you closer to the Welder, and then when you play the Welder, you draw 3 more cards, make it even easier to continue that engine going.
I'm not sure if I'm quite as enthusiastic. Like I mentioned at the beginning of our introduction on this card, like having item-based form of draw is very, very strong, but this is one of those cards I just need to get hands-on time with to decide how I feel about it. I can only theoremon about this thing so much. In a deck that relies on non-draw based forms of supporters, so think of something like Red and Blue, or Bead, or Ends Resolve, that you play Oranguru in, I think you could play Nugget in those decks as a way to get around your supporter being taken up by these non-draw based options. So that's an area where I wouldn't mind seeing Nugget experimented in. But at the same time, maybe sometimes just playing Dedenne is just better than this at the end of the day. Or an Acrobite, just as an example. I think I'm going to remain a little bit neutral on Nugget. Not because this effect is bad, drawing 3 via an item is really strong. But like with those other cards we mentioned, like the Luxio and Lombre, we have Reset Stamp, we have Marnie, we have ways to, influence your opponent's top deck. And there might just be better ways at drawing additional cards. I'm cautiously optimistic about it, I'll give it that. Next up, guys, we have a new supporter that is going to be Oleana or Oleana. I'm not sure how exactly you pronounce this lady. But supporter card says discard 2 cards from your hand in order to play this. Then your opponent reveals their hand and you choose a trainer you find there and put it at the bottom of your opponent's deck. I'm guessing this is what they're trying to push you to play with Malamar VMAX. I'm guessing. However, I'm really not a big fan of this card, specifically in Standard especially, because you have to discard 2 cards from your hand, and then if your opponent doesn't even have a trainer card in their hand, you basically just discarded 2 cards for no reason, and your supporter for turn is gone. And then the trainer they have to have there is one that needs to be impactful for their next turn. So this effect seems really, really weak. Now, granted, if you're playing something like Lavender Town, I guess that could help you know when to time your Oleana here. Xander, you might have better input, just because it seems like maybe more of a control style card. I know that's more of your wheelhouse. Expanded also seems like an area where this could be a bit better, but Standard specifically, this card seems pretty bad.
I think this card has a specific niche, but I don't really know what it is yet. In Standard, I think that the Malamar deck probably doesn't need this because you can get the most powerful card out of their hand and put it on the bottom, And normally between Reset Stamp and Marnie, you're going to have their hand at a low enough size that I feel like they're probably only going to have one great option for what to get rid of, and then you kind of can leave them with a mediocre hand. In terms of expanded, where Stamp is banned, Surge is banned, so you couldn't go like Surge and Alina, I think that this card is probably not that great overall. The threat density in expanded, though decks are playing less copies of supporters because they can play Versus Seeker, they're just more consistent overall because they have such powerful engines. So I don't think this card is really that great. You're only getting one thing from their hand. So if you look at a hand with double Versus Seeker, you've wasted your supporter even though you're getting rid of something. And frankly, you might have helped them if they're going to play a Juniper or a Sycamore or something on their next turn.
Yeah, right there with you, man. I think this card's like straight A garbage. I think expanded, it does get a little tempting because you have propagation execute, so it makes your discards a little less painful. But yeah, overall, I think this is pretty weak, especially compared to all the other very strong disruption options that already exist in the format. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new item card that is going to be Scoop Up Net. It says, put one of your Pokemon, excluding Pokemon V and GX, into your hand and discard all cards attached to that Pokemon. So this card is absolutely insane. Like, this card is easily one of the top 5 cards in the set. This is a card that is insane for single prize decks out there, which I think is a very good thing for the game, just in general. And this is going to be mainly good for Pokemon with abilities in particular, specifically coming into play abilities. So think of something like the Inteleon that we just got from Sword and Shield. The Drizzile and Inteleon both have these very, very strong coming into play abilities. But of course, after you've used them, they just kind of sit there on your bench. Scoop Up Net will allow you to bring up the entire evolution line back to your hand and start reusing those abilities. Also think of something like Galarian Obstagoon as well, being able to reuse Zigzagoon's ability or even Obstagoon's ability, or even maybe just picking up other things from your bench and taking away some of your opponent's like catcher targets to be able to like get around your Obstagoon. This is going to be probably another card that's very, very powerful whenever we have a skateboard rotate and we need a way to get our Jirachis out of harm's way. There's just a ton of applications for this. Me and Xander spent a good bit of time combing through the card pool, and there's just an insane amount of cards that could benefit from something like this. So,
well, I've got a lot to say because this card's really good. In terms of standard, I think I'm playing this card already with Jirachi, because if you're playing it with Jirachi, the text effectively becomes, look at the top 5 cards of your deck, choose a trainer that you find there, put it into your hand, which sounds a lot like Trainer's Mail, which is a very playable card, except it can also get Scoop Up Net off itself. Like, Trainer's Mail could not get Trainer's Mail, but Scoop Up Net can get Scoop Up Net. So if you're digging for like a boss's order for game, and then you whiff, but you hit a Scoop Up Net, you kind of get to spin the wheel one more time. So I think that's really powerful. And outside of that, there's a bunch of like decent non-GXs, like Inteleon, where you can like search your deck for the items, put them into your hand, and then you could Scoop Up Net to kind of do it again. Or even something like Obstagoon. In terms of expanded, and this is where I've seen everyone on the internet flipping out, there is a bunch of really powerful stuff you can do. First off, you can turn it into another Shaman. So setup, you can just use it over and over again. Scoop Up Net returns it to your hand. And there were already some decks that were considering playing Scoop Up Cyclone, and there were some versions that played Super Scoop Up just to reuse Shaman. Seismitoad is an EX Pokemon, but with Seismitoad, you can put a Fury Belt on it, and it has 220 HP and is Quaking Punching, and if they hit you, you get a free Acerola, and you get to play a real supporter, which is really good. And then lastly, the most notorious one that I think, you can Scoop Up Wailord. Wailord, you put a Fury Belt on it, it has 290 HP, and then you can return the Wailord to your hand because it's an EX Pokemon. So in Expanded, it's a much more degenerate card than it is in Standard, either just letting you draw through your deck like crazy or just make the game go really long. Whereas in Standard, you're still just kind of like getting incremental advantage. But the card is very solid, and it's definitely going to... There are some cards that... Like, Welder has changed how we think about every single fire Pokemon that has came out so far. Scoop Up Net is going to change how we think about every single non-GX Pokemon or non-V Pokemon that comes out since its release. So, card is great. Very good.
If we wanted to, we could actually probably do an entire video just on Scoop Up Net alone because the card pool is so massive, and especially once you get into Expanded, going back all the way to Black and White, there's just so many cards that can potentially use something like this to great effect. You know, even think back to like the Crobat evolution line as well from Phantom Forces. That was a evolution line that loved Super Scoop Up, which was a coin flip. So being able to have a card like that have access to Scoop Up Net is also very good as well. But yeah, you can see I'm getting sidetracked again talking about another idea that just comes to my mind because there's so many practical applications for this thing. So Scoop Up Net, like I said, not only is this a good card, for me, I think this is definitely within maybe even the top 5 best cards in the set. Next up, guys, we actually have a reprint we're going to be talking about. That is going to be Skyla. Skyla is a supporter card. It says search your deck for a trainer card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is actually a card that came out a long time ago, all the way back in 2012, back in Boundaries Crossed, and actually saw a lot of play when it was originally printed. We also saw it get a reprint as a full art back in Breakpoint during the XY era. So it is a card that has come and gone over time and has seen varying degrees of success. But unfortunately, I don't think in 2020 Skyla is going to be the same solid supporter that it once was. I think this card is just generally going to be too slow. And unlike in some of these previous formats I mentioned, there's already some other pretty strong searching supporters that this has to directly compete with. Because we have Volkner, we have Green's Exploration, we even have Bill's Analysis. There's even other stuff like Red's Challenge. So Skyla has a lot more competition for this style of supporter. And I just really don't know what deck is going to mind taking a turn off of drawing cards for one specific trainer card, especially too since we have Jirachi in this format as well. That's easily been the most effective way at finding trainer cards in this format. You know, even though it's nostalgic and kind of nice to see an old favorite like this come back into the game, I'm not sure if I'm actually excited to use it in this day and age, though.
Yeah, this card gets a hasty downvote for me. First off, you kind of have to compete with Rosa for the search for a trainer kind of effect. Like, is it better to be able to play Skyla whenever I want than it is to play Rosa whenever I get knocked out and also get a Pokemon and an energy out of the deal? And I think the answer is Rosa, just because a lot of decks are playing Jirachi. Jirachi's going to get knocked out just by looking at it, and then Rosa just becomes a better card immediately. And in all the Stage 2 decks, like we played Skyla to get Rare Candy, well, now we can just play Rosa when our Jirachi gets knocked out to get our Stage 2 Rare Candy and an energy to attach to it. So that's immediately worse. Overall, I am not that excited for Skyla, and think it's just going to be sitting in Standard without really much of a purpose.
Yeah, its only purpose is basically just to drive back up the cost of the old full arts. That's the biggest impact this card will have, is on like the secondary markets and not the actual game itself. So yeah, Skyla, again, it's nice to see an old favorite come back, but this is not a very good card in the current state of the game, unfortunately. Next up, guys, we have a new supporter, and that is going to be Sonya. It says search your deck for up to 2 basic Pokemon or up to 2 basic energies, reveal them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this card's like pretty similar to some other supporters we've had in like over the course of the game. It's kind of similar to Fan Club. It's kind of similar to Roseanne's Research, but not quite the same as either of those. But Xander, I remember you had some pretty strong thoughts on this, so I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, this card is really bad. This card is not good whatsoever. First off, we have Quick Ball, which I think is just a much better consistency card than trying to play a supporter. Secondly, you can't play supporters going first anyway, so most decks that would even consider playing this probably wouldn't, because they only get to play it half the time on their first turn. And 3, I don't know why getting a Pokemon and an energy like Roseanne's Research would even be busted. Like, we live in a Standard where you can discard your hand, draw 7 every turn of the game. Lysander's reprinted, but no. Searching your deck for 1 Pokemon, 1 basic Pokemon, and 1 energy is too dang good. So, like, this card is very bad. I think there are a few things that could be done to make this card better, but, like, this card, as it's printed, is just not good. I wish that it was playable, because I think Sonya's a cool character, and it's just sad that this is kind of a big letdown in terms of, like, this card's just not going to see any play, really.
These types of cards in particular took a big hit after the first turn rule changes, and there's other cards that are items now that can do something very similar. So this card's definitely better than Fan Club. Like, literally, you can probably sell all of your Fan Clubs, and because this is literally just a direct upgrade of Pokemon Fan Club. But I still don't think it's going to see much play. I really wish this was search your deck for up to 2 basic Pokemon and 2 basic energy, or at least have you combine them like Roseanne's Research. That Xander was kind of alluding to there. And even then, I don't even know if it would have seen widespread play. So yeah, not a big fan of this card. If it does see play, it'll be very, very fringe play, but unfortunately just not good enough, I think, to cut it in 2020. Next up, guys, we have another returning favorite from the 2012 era of the game, and that's going to be Tool Scrapper. So Tool Scrapper is an item card. It says discard up to 2 Pokemon tools from either player's Pokemon. So I think this is definitely a welcome inclusion back into the game. We did lose Field Blower in the previous rotation, which was definitely one of the most impactful staples that we had, during its lifetime in Standard. And up until now, we've had some kind of clunky ways at dealing with tools. Lysander Labs has probably been the best way. And Lysander Labs, of course, is your stadium card, which means you can't play other more impactful stadiums, and it can be removed from play. And Tool Scrapper actually discards the tools and not just turns them off. So Tool Scrapper, I think, is actually, a great card to see come back into the game. Not quite as good as Field Blower because you can't get rid of stadiums, but nevertheless, being able to get rid of those tools is going to be good. And now presents kind of a bigger threat to some of the passive tool cards that have been in the format. So think of something like Spell Tag or Lucky Egg, just as an example. I think these types of cards get much worse after Rebel Clash because they're going to have to sit and play and give you time to find a Tool Scrapper and remove them. That also means things like your escape boards aren't going to be quite as safe on your Jirachis as well.
I'm going to say this, and a lot of people are going to be very confused, but it'll make sense. Don't play fewer Tool Scrappers in your deck because it's not Field Blower. I think that a lot of people, whenever a worse card gets reprinted back into Standard, they're like, oh, well, it's not as good as the one that we used to play, so, we don't need as many. Where you might not play, there were some decks that played 3 Field Blower in the Garbotoxin eras. I think that this effect is still really powerful, and I'd probably play, 1 or 2, especially if you're playing something like Absol already to mess up Retreat with the escape boards and air balloons that are out there. All of the Tangrowth and Milotic and Probopass, they're all screaming for this card because you get to turn off stuff like that. This card is really solid. If you've been playing for a while, congrats, you own some, but definitely pick up some. It's just going to be a little dorky, uncommon, and it's going to be really good.
So happy to have Tool Scrapper back and have really just any effective way at combating against tools back. Definitely makes for some more interesting deck building options going forward. So I definitely expect to see this card see a lot of play, probably just as a one-of in most decks, but nevertheless, it will definitely see play. Next up, guys, we have another stadium card, and that is going to be Training Court. It says, once during each player's turn, that player may choose a basic energy card from their discard pile, reveal it, and put it into their hand. So it's kind of like the inverse of Viridian, which is kind of cool. There's no discarding to it as well. So that is definitely an advantage it has over Viridian in that way. But I think about this card a lot like how I feel about other cards like Eldegoss, just as an example, compared to Tapu Lele. So we saw Tapu Lele as a 3, sometimes 4 of while it was legal in Standard, whereas Eldegoss is probably only going to be a 1 to 2 of in most decks just because it's much more consistent to get cards out of your deck than to wait for them to get into your discard pile and then retrieve them out of there. And I think this is kind of the same thing, even though this is the inverse of Viridian and doesn't have the discarding effect. I think it's generally more consistent just to get energy out of your deck than to wait for it to hit the discard pile. And on top of that, the discarding effect from Viridian I think is actually good in a lot of decks. And there's other cards like Energy Retrieval that will allow you to get 2 energies out of your discard pile. This can be better than Energy Retrieval in certain instances. Like this can effectively be a counter stadium and get you an energy in the process, which Energy Retrieval can't do. But of course, with this being such a stadium heavy metagame that we've been in lately, I don't think this is realistically going to stay for longer than 1, maybe 2 turns at most. So I think very best case scenario, this is going to be an Energy Retrieval. So I think I would rather just play that to begin with if I was going to. I don't hate this card. I really don't think this is a bad effect, but I think it has too much to compete with. And I'm kind of leaning closer to saying this won't see play than seeing play.
I think that once Viridian rotates, we can think about this card being a better replacement. But especially for now, Viridian is a solidly better card than this. The advantage of Viridian is normally when you're playing it, you want the energy early game. You don't want it late game. And late game, you have a surplus of energy. This card is just not seeing play until Viridian rotates.
So next up, we have a new stadium card that is going to be Turffield. It says, once during each player's turn, that player may search their deck for a grass evolution Pokemon, reveal it, and put it into their hand. Then that player shuffles their deck. We already talked about a couple of grass Pokemon. Even in this set review that could potentially abuse this. I think one of the big ones is going to be Rilla Boom VMAX, and of course the regular Rilla Boom that we just got in Sword and Shield. But where I'm actually a little bit more excited to maybe take a look at this card is actually with Lost March. I think Lost March is a deck that actually can potentially come back after Rebel Clash. It gets this plus Twin Energy. I think just having those two cards alone are kind of enough to rejuvenate that archetype. And also, you got my boy Flapple that we talked about in the same set review. Obviously stoked to use it with Turffield here, being able to shuffle it into your deck after you use its ability, then grab it right back out. So it basically just forces us to reevaluate any grass Pokemon that get printed until this card rotates. And I think this is definitely a nice consistency booster, especially if those decks already don't have a different stadium that they would be reliant on.
Yeah, I think this is pretty neat. In Expanded, you can use this to get a Selgor just to make the loop a little bit easier. That deck likes to play Silent Lab sometimes, so it might not be the right home for it, but it's still pretty neat. Also, just the normal Rowegg Expanded deck probably just plays this card like pretty quickly. There are different versions that play like both Vileplumes, obviously, but then some play the Sceptile, some play other stuff, some play Exeggutor, so this can help you find the right tool for the job there. It's just a very good consistency card.
Yeah, we could easily just go down the entire card pool and tell you every grass evolution, but I'm always a big fan of anything that helps evolution decks, especially single prize decks, and Turffield is going to be a card that does that. So I'm really happy to have it in the game. I think it's a good card. Next up, guys, we have our first special energy we're going to be talking about. That's going to be Capture Energy. So this is a special energy. It says it provides one colorless energy while attached, but then when attaching this card from your hand to one of your Pokemon, search your deck for a basic Pokemon and put it on your bench, then shuffle your deck. So this is basically kind of like a reprint of the old Call Energy, which saw a ton of play. Granted, some of the rules now are a little bit different than back when that card existed, but nevertheless, I think its effect is actually really cool. I've actually caught myself thinking over this past year when building a couple of different decks here and there, thinking, man, it'd be cool if we had Call Energy. This would make this deck a little bit better. And so I'm glad we finally have something like that again. A couple of ideas that kind of came to my head immediately would be like Porygon Z variants, maybe even the Empoleon or Gallades from Cosmic Eclipse, maybe even Volcarona GX if that ever starts to see any play. I think this is a great card to have in the format, and you'll basically always have to keep your eye on it as long as we have Pokemon that are attacking for at least one colorless energy.
Yeah, and I think that between Call Energy getting you 2 and ending your turn, and this getting you 1 and not ending your turn, I still think this is better. Because you can attach this before you play a Research or something like that. Or like you can attach this and then get a Zacian on your board and then use Intrepid Sword to end your turn. Like I think that a deck that plays this almost immediately is like the mill decks, because I think that they like Resource Management uses colorless. You use this to get Mincino or a Zacian, like I just said, and helps that out a lot. But I mean, this card's just good. Like it's generically powerful and is always going to be a consideration. If we end up in a metagame that has a lot of item lock, which we're not in right now, but if that does come back, this gets around not being able to play quick balls and other cards of that variety. It definitely makes going first not as punishing for decks that are trying to set up. So I think that this card's pretty solid overall. I don't know how many I'm playing or what I'm playing it in, but it's going to make an impact, and there are players that are better than me that are going to figure out exactly where this sees play.
I think this card's pretty cool. It's definitely not like Scoop Up Net tier good or Galar Mine good or anything like that. But I think this is definitely one of the more like fairly balanced, decent, good cards that came out in the set. So for the next special energy we're looking at, it's going to be Horror Psychic Energy. This is one of the new like type-specific special energies that look to be getting reintroduced into the game. And this one says it provides one Psychic Energy while it's attached to a Pokemon, and then when the Psychic Pokemon this card is attached to is your active Pokemon and is damaged by an opponent's attack, put 2 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. So one thing I actually really like about this and the Lightning Energy we're going to be looking at is that unlike the special energies that came out back during the XY era that were type specific like this, you can even attach them to Pokemon outside of their respective type. Whereas the old ones, they had to get discarded or you weren't allowed to even attach them. So that is definitely an immediate upside to this. And this is actually just kind of a reprint of one of those old ones. It's a reprint of the dark one that existed at the time. Now, I will say this, the dark special energy saw like virtually no play, but I think this one's actually in a much different spot because there are a lot of psychic Pokemon this synergizes pretty well with. So of course, In Standard right now, we have Spell Tag in the format. We have this. We have things like Giratina with its Distortion Door ability. We have Espeon Deoxys. Being able to place damage counters very specifically is something Psychic does really well right now. And this is another card to add to your arsenal to sort of like compound that whole strategy. So I think this card is actually really, really cool. I think the Lightning Energy might end up stealing a lot of the thunder, no pun intended, overall. But I definitely don't think people should sleep on this. I actually think this card is really cool.
Yeah, I think people using the logic of, well, Dangerous Energy was never good, so this card must be bad, is not necessarily the case, because the reason why Dangerous Energy was never good was because there was just not a good Dark deck during the time that Dangerous Energy was legal. Yveltal and Turbo Dark, which I was about to mention, both wanted basic energies because of Oblivion Wing and Max Loop, respectively. So the space in your deck was not necessarily worth it for these cards, and in that standard, you had Muscle Band. In this standard, where you don't have as much ways to increase your damage, specifically, the Malamar decks spread a ton of damage counters around, and this is just a great addition to that deck as well. The card is really solid. I think it's going to be interesting to see where this card makes a splash, but it's definitely good.
Yeah, and even looking to the expanded format, I definitely think there's some cards over there that would love this. I think Trevenant's going to be one of the big ones. You can probably even just cut all of your basic energies and just play 4 of these and 4 mysteries. Call it a day. Trevenant already is like one of the better spread decks that's existed in that format, so this is great for that. Also, you could maybe try to rejuvenate the Wobbuffet Crobat deck, especially now that we have Scoop Up Net getting printed in the same set and the Psychic Energy. So that deck definitely gets some additional options too. But yeah, overall, I'm a big fan of this card. I think it's super solid. Next up, guys, we have Speed Lightning Energy. This is going to be the other of the type-specific energies coming out in Rebel Clash. And this one says it provides 1 Lightning Energy while attached to a Pokemon, and whenever you attach this card from your hand to a Lightning Pokemon, draw 2 cards. Like, can we talk about the absolute glow up special Lightning Energies have now from Flash Energy, which just got rid of your weakness, to now giving you a card that allows you to draw cards after you attach it. This card is just blatantly super, super good. I mean, it just immediately slots into Pikarom. You're probably cutting any copies of Unit Energy you were playing if you were playing like Guzma Hala in your deck, and just throwing in probably 2, maybe even 3 of these. I don't really expect to see a full-on 4 count, but I'd imagine 2 is probably a safe bet for Pikarom. Not that Pikarom even needs anything else at this point, but hey, it's another card for that. We also, of course, are getting both Bolton V and Toxtricity VMAX in the same set. This is just a super, super good card.
In Pikarom, it's disgusting where you can go Guzma Hala and get Thunder Mountain and Speed Lightning, and then probably a skateboard to retreat whatever your active is. Just makes it so much easier to turn 1 full blitz. Pikarom's probably not maxing out on these. Toxicity probably is maxing out on these. And most likely any Lightning deck that comes out after this point is just going to be throwing as many of these into their deck. Like, could you imagine this card being legal whenever Zapdos was the best deck in format? I would have been screaming. Yeah, like, that would have been something else. And I'm very glad that these were not in the same stand. Let's hope that Pokemon doesn't print anything crazier than this, because this card is already very good.
Yeah, I think it's probably the best of the special energies we've looked at thus far. I think it'll be a competition between this and Twin Energy for the best one out of the set, but no shortage of great special energies out of the set. So big thumbs up for me too. Alrighty guys, so the very last card we have here to round out our Rebel Clash set review is going to be Twin Energy. So Twin Energy, it provides 2 colorless energy, and if this card is attached to a Pokemon V or Pokemon GX, it only provides 1 colorless energy instead. So this is basically a double colorless energy reprint, but only for 1 prizers, which is amazing, I think. I'm so stoked on this. This card is definitely going to be very impactful. You know, we had people even cheerleading for double colorless energy to get banned like a season or so ago because of how strong double colorless energy was in certain decks. Now, granted, Twin Energy is not quite as good because it is limited to only 1 prizers, but nevertheless, I mean, this is still a huge boost to so many decks out there. By the time this video goes up, we actually should have had a Twin Energy video go up as well, where I actually list all of the different uses for a card like this, both in Standard and Expanded, but just a couple of them that come to mind for Standard specifically. We have a couple of Stage 2s that came out in recent sets, like Empoleon and Gallade back from Cosmic Eclipse. We have Weezing from Unbroken Bonds. We even have like the new Flapple that's coming out in this set. There's the Steelix that discards like Pokemon with a 4 retreat cost. The Corviknight back from the previous Sword and Shield set. And I think probably the most impactful one I could think of for standard, probably Lost March. Between this and Turffield, I think that deck actually gets a huge boost coming out of Rebel Clash. So there's a lot to really like with this card. And I think this is going to be definitely one of the most impactful energies that we have, once it gets printed.
Yeah, this card's great. It's like, it's in the category of cards that we are going to completely reevaluate everything that comes out after this. I know that a lot of people are very worried about like Seismitoad having 4 more DCEs, and I don't think that's anywhere near justified concern. I'm much more concerned about Scoop Up Net for Toad than I am about that deck having 4 more DCEs. Like, I don't even think that you play 8 DCE Toad. You're going to have to completely look back through the standard card pool or just watch Eric's video to see how many great cards this really enables. But it's really good, and it's a really cool card, and you definitely should pick up some.
Like you mentioned with Seismitoad, we do have to not only look at the standard format, but even the expanded format as well. So, of course, we have Toad, but just to name a couple of other ones, of course, we have Vespiquen, Excelgor, even things like Passimian as well. So between standard and expand, there's plenty of different decks that are going to want to abuse this. So I definitely think Twin Energy is going to be a fantastic card as soon as it gets released. Alrighty guys, so you finally made it to the end of the set review. Thanks so much for sticking with us throughout this whole thing. I know our set reviews do tend to be a little bit on the longer side, but of course we're just trying to give our most in-depth thoughts on these cards as much as possible. So before we wrap up this video, just want to go over some final thoughts about the set as a whole. Ultimately, we're going to settle on giving Rebel Clash a 4 out of 5. This is definitely a very, very solid follow-up to our Sword and Shield base set. So some of the more positive things about the set is that we're getting actually a bunch of new Pokemon V and Pokemon VMAX as you'd expect, and a lot of them are actually luckily pretty good. We have a number of different ones. We have like support Pokemon like Eldegoss V that are obviously very good. We have regular Pokemon V like Bolton. There's also things like Phalanx V. And then of course we have a bunch of new Pokemon VMAX that I think look to finally make an impact in the standard format, like Dragapult, Toxtricity, and Copperage, all as a few examples, all seem pretty solid. We actually have several new staple cards, including the new Eldegoss V that we just mentioned, but also some trainer cards like Tool Scrapper coming back in the format to get rid of Pokemon tools, and of course the big one itself, it's going to be Boss's Orders. We finally have a supporter-based, reliable form of gusting coming back into the format. And not only do we have some great new trainer cards, but we actually have some fantastic new special energies. I might even say Rebel Clash has the best collection of special energies the game has ever seen. I know it's a pretty bold statement to make, but all 4 in the set are really fantastic. But on the flip side, there are definitely a few cons to the set. I think probably the most glaring one is that the trainer cards are generally kind of a mixed bag, especially when you compare it to Sword and Shield, which had an utterly fantastic collection of trainer cards across the board. I think some of these do wind up being a little bit mediocre, despite having some big winners like Tool Scrapper, like I already pointed out. And the other con, this is more of just kind of a personal, subjective thing, but if Dragapult VMAX does start to catch on like it has been in Japan lately, that could potentially threaten the viability of one prize attackers in the format going forward. You guys know me, I'm a big fan of one prize decks, stage 2 decks, so that could potentially continue to push the game maybe in a less than ideal direction. But again, that's more of just a personal subjective thing. But overall, like I said, guys, this is definitely a great set, very worthy follow-up to Sword and Shield. And with that, guys, we are finally at the very end of this set review. If you did enjoy this content, of course, feel free to like and subscribe, and consider supporting this channel as well by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg, or pick up some merch from our online store, rarecandytcg.com. It would mean a lot. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.